Welcome, Assembly Member Hall, to our meeting today. So our main discussion is going to be on taxi and private hire services, and I'm told to encourage everyone to use social media using hashtag Assembly Transport and hashtag Cab Review. And welcome the visitors we've got in our public gallery. And could I ask everyone in the gallery and also in the chamber to make sure their electronic devices are switched to silent mode, and that's silent rather than vibration, please, to avoid any interruptions. Declarations of interest. Are there any other declarations other than those noted in the paperwork? No? Lovely. Take those. Thank you. Minutes. Can we agree the minutes from our 12th of September meeting as to be signed by me as a correct record? Agreed. Thank you very much. Can we note our summary list of actions set out in the report?
Noted.
Wonderful. Lovely. Then let's move into our item on taxis and private hire services. And just for the benefit of people watching this today, this is the first of a number of meetings we're having around this subject. Today we're hearing from the industry. We've got private hire sector first, and then we've got the black taxi sector second. We'll then be having meetings with TfL, with cycling groups, pedestrian groups, and we'll be having a Dragon's Den afternoon or morning where we will back-to-back meet and talk to people who are interested in this and want to give us some specific evidence. So we really will be soaking up all the evidence out there from different interest groups. This isn't just us talking to the private hire and taxi industry and no one else at all. So please be assured of that today. So I'd like to welcome our guests on our first panel. We've got Steve Wright before us, who's the chair of the Licensed Private Hire Car Association, LPHCA. Welcome, Steve. Good to see you again. Robert Scott, who's the Managing Director of Greater London Hire, a big private hire operator in the capital. And Andrew Wescott, who's Head of Regulatory and External Affairs for Addison Lee. I would like to put on record, we did ask Uber to come and attend a session in public, and they refused to come before the committee in public. We also did have another app operator, ViaVan, who we'd asked to come along, and they were going to, and then for various reasons they had to pull out at the last minute. And throughout this morning we had tried to get some of the app operators to come along, but unfortunately they were not able to today. Right, I will start off the questions on private hire. As a committee, we did look at this a few years ago. We put out a pretty damning report on TfL's role as a regulator, and we said they were, at the time, I think we said they were woefully inadequate. Obviously, things we hope will have changed and improved since then. But looking at private hire, my first question to you, or maybe Steve, you would like to start, is just what are the key challenges facing the private hire trade in London?
I think we're faced with some very unrealistic costs now that are a barrier to entry, that are stifling entrepreneurism and unprecedented bureaucracy. There's also a level of over-regulation. The private hire industry, I came along to Marsham Street before this building was here to discuss this with the carriage office and the Assembly elect people. And we've worked very carefully for a long period of time to get private hire up to great standards. And all the compliance meetings we attend will point out to you that the industry itself is very, very compliant. Now, there's been a lessening of that compliance via the app-only companies who've come in and that don't have the checks and measures and the structures in place that the traditional companies have. So what seems to be happening is we seem to be getting regulation and cost thrust upon us that are as a consequence of these companies, when the actual bona fide industry, I mean, Rob's company's been here for over 50 years, Addison Lee, a similar amount of time, have been working perfectly well. And the regulation is causing a lot of cost and a lot of unnecessary angst on perfectly good companies that ironically are now getting put out of business because of cost and the amount of regulation they're needing to actually have to do. So that's the simple answer to that question, Caroline.
Okay, you're saying you don't want as much regulation, or do you think there needs to be a difference in the regulation between traditional operators and app operators?
Yes, I actually believe that the business models are different, and the type of regulation that an app operator will need is entirely different. There is no call centre full of people and human beings to respond to you when you've got no pickup or you can't find the car or whatever. And they are structured differently. There is no customer care in these. They're very sterile, money-making offshore entities that are coming in with massive subsidies and tax arrangements that are really undermining what was working perfectly well prior to their arrival.
Okay, thank you. Robert, do you want to comment on the challenges facing the sector?
Yeah, I concur with Steve's opinion. I've got nothing against competition, and I think that's fine. But it does seem to me that many of London's problems have been caused by the app-only companies, and much of the regulation which seems to have been created recently has been to deal with those issues, and maybe unfairly having an effect upon more established companies who work in a different manner. It's not the only issue which affects us. I think we're all looking towards the air quality targets, and that's more of a positive challenge, if you like, which we're looking to achieve. But it's not going to be easy, but it's something more, something which I think will benefit London, and that's a challenge, certainly. Yes, I think there has been over-regulation, and I think some of the regulation a little bit skewed, and I feel sometimes that as an established private hire company, and there are many cab companies or private hire companies in London, I think they've been hit hard by regulation designed to counter effects which have been caused by app-only companies.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think the issue with regulation is that it's been catching up, I think, with the technological changes and the disruptions that have been happening in the industry. So I think there's something there about having sort of regulation that's perhaps more flexible, a bit more pragmatic. Clearly there's a challenge with the legislation in that sense, in that it's somewhat out of date, both in London and even more so outside of London. So there's something perhaps to look at there, but with some caution. I think, mobility's changing, London's changing, sort of trends in terms of, the demographics and younger people not, driving private vehicles or having licenses. These things are all changing, and I think the regulation needs to reflect that, because that then impacts on the type of services that we see being offered in London, in terms of whether it's private hire, people using buses, or things like Zipcars. So I think there's a sort of a new kind of transport network out there that's integrating with the traditional, and I think the regulation needs to sort of take more thought of that as it develops.
What are your views about TfL's performance as a regulator of the private hire industry? Are they doing well? Are they doing better? Are there areas they need to really improve? Who'd like to go first? Steve?
Well, unfortunately, in recent years, it's not been improving. There's lots of policy being made without the dialogue that's essential with the industry. I mean, I came along to the Public Carriage Office in the 90s before regulation was in place to talk to the Public Carriage Office. That engagement seems to now being told what's going to be happen because a policy's been made. Now, the essential loop that's missing out of that, the English language test is a classic example of it, what we've ended up with.
We're going to get on to that in detail.
The point I'm sort of making is that if you don't engage with the industry about the requirements, and then you introduce policy, you end up with a nightmare. You end up with challenges in the court. You end up with nobody really understanding what the necessities are. And I think there's been a period that I would say is improving now. The engagement is improving right now. There does seem to be a bit of a sea change in recent times, but we've had a couple of years where it's just drifted. And obviously, one of the other checks and measures that hasn't happened, and I was obviously on the TfL board for 2 years, 2 periods of service, and I worked with Ken Livingstone prior to that, and all the political parties, is there is no real expertise in either taxi or private hire within the organisation of TfL. There's no industry experts, there's policy makers. Now, if those policy makers fail to engage with the trade, they end up coming up with policy that's not fit for purpose, and that unravels itself by poor regulations, extreme costs, and problems and challenges in the courts. In my view, all that could be avoided by proper dialogue with the trade at the ground level.
You said it's just started to improve.
It has, yeah.
What
does seem to-
timescale? The last year, the last 6 months?
I would say the last 6 months in particular,
Right,
there
okay.
has definitely been improved dialogue. I'll give you an example. We complained bitterly about the 8-week consultation period on fees. We weren't told about the fees. It wasn't discussed with us. That happened. Now we've got a 12-week consultation period. Now we're having pre-engagement prior to the consultation period. That seems to have happened now. Now, whether that's what that's a result of, I don't know. But there is a bit of an improvement, and that's the place we need to get to, because the industry wants regulations that are fit for purpose, that are safe, that deliver the things that the London Assembly and TfL want to do. That's achieved by having dialogue before policy is established.
Andrew, you
Yeah,
agree with that?
I mean, generally the relationship I find constructive and respectful. You know, I think it's good, generally productive. But I think Steve's right in the sense that there's a difference between engagement and consultation, and I think at the moment perhaps the engagement process is being missed, and I think English language and the congestion charge exemption, which I'm sure we'll move on to, are two examples of that, where we're effectively offered this is the policy, what do you think of it, rather than being brought in at a much earlier stage. And when I think there were independent consultants brought in to speak to us, but that's more at arm's length, and I think you need to speak actually directly to the regulator in those situations. I think, sorry.
So is there any sort of engagement forum for the private hire industry to come in? I know we often hear from the taxi side how they're not really engaged properly, but
Yeah, we have quarterly
meetings.
with the licensing teams at TfL. So.
and does it feel like it's a two-way dialogue, or is it one way?
To me, it's a constructive dialogue. I have to say I've been in the industry for about 7 months, so I've been to a couple of meetings and they've been constructive to me. But Steve might have a different
Robert,
view. Rob,
do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it has improved recently. I think obviously TfL are dealing with many issues, so they've got many things.
Could
to
you speak up a bit, Robert?
Sorry,
I'm struggling to hear you.
they have many things to deal with, and I appreciate the job they have. I would say from a grassroots level, it's rather difficult to communicate with them if, say, you're a driver with a licensing issue, that type of thing. That can be tricky. I think almost in a way they're overstretched in many ways.
Okay.
But certainly on the other side, as Steve mentions, I believe that they're wishing to engage more, and that's been a recent development.
Okay.
Yeah, I would endorse that. I mean, I'll give you a classic example. We found out about the operator fees the night before. You know, the night before, you're going to massively change the whole demographic. And then when we did consult, the consultation process was completely ignored. They took on the view of our competitors in the taxi trade, who obviously wanted us to be paying more fees. And we end up with a system that's now completely not fit for purpose. It's putting people out of business. And it's the same with the congestion charge. We learned of the congestion charge in the media. Until the policy came out, we learned about it in the media, and I made this point to Mike Brown. This isn't really the way to respectfully deal with an industry or get the best outcomes. I've been coming to this place and Marsham Street, and prior to Marsham Street, the public carriage office, in my own time to try and help the system be better. We're a resource that can be utilised, and I'm pleased to say that it appears to be some people from TfL's press office have found their way into the taxi and private hire directorate, as it were, and they're communicators. And I think that's a key thing. The communication and the engagement could definitely be improved. And if we can work to make that get back to what it used to be and beyond, it'd be much better.
Now, I just want to pick up the issue of Uber and say they're not at the table, but we did ask them to come along today. They were given a 15-month licence with a number of conditions. Do you have a view on what conditions TfL should put in place on Uber if it renews its licence? Have you any thoughts on that?
Well, it's been in breach of so many things. I've got to tell you, I was an operator for 25 years, and if I'd done a tenth of what Uber had done, I would have lost my licence. I would have been out of business, without any shadow of doubt. I mean, we were the first trade association to formally complain about them running around with one of our cars with no insurance for 2 weeks. That would have been a sort of terrible misdemeanour, and they got a fine. and they were allowed to carry on. I mean, it seems to be the amount of things that they've done wrong are absolutely beyond belief, failing to report sexual assaults and all the other things that have gone on. It's an endless list. We're extremely worried about the magistrates' court, the shareholder husband that's got shares in Uber of the magistrate and that sort of thing. I mean, I think TfL were right to take the action they did, but it should have happened a lot earlier, to be quite honest with you. They've done so many things that are wrong. Now, I talked to a very wily politician, I won't name the party, a while ago. He said, Mr. Wright, you've got a bit of a problem. They're popular. Well, popular doesn't mean good, and popular doesn't mean safe. And because they're popular, because they're cheap, and they're cheap because of their tax arrangements and 1,000,001 other things. But they should have to play by exactly the same stringent rules that the rest of the people. It's no good saying because they're a big company they're going to have more problems. If they've got the problems, when TfL, if they're minded to give them the full licence back after this probationary period, it should come with a raft of conditions that they need to meet. I don't want to go into speculating what those conditions mean, should be, but there should be very stringent conditions on the company.
Okay, so basically a full range of tight conditions, and they should monitor and enforce.
Yes, it mustn't be a slap wrist, slap wrist and back to what we used to do. We can't have that at all.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. We're going to move on to our next set of questions, and one of the things that we want to look at in this investigation is how we can improve standards, drive standards up. And Sean, you're going to lead this to us.
Morning, gentlemen. Like the Chair said, we're focused on improving standards for drivers, etc. So my first question will be, what are your views on TfL's proposal to toughen requirements for private hire drivers? Maybe if I start with Steve.
Well, I was on the Sector Skills Council for 10 years, helping to get standards in for private hire drivers, and I've been very much of wanting standards. I mean, what standards need to be is fit for purpose. The standards need to be appropriate to the need of the customers, they need to be appropriate to the needs of the operators and to the needs of the drivers. I note in the Mayor's action plan it did mention training for drivers. What training? There's been no training. It's absolutely essential that, what's needed isn't necessarily regulatory controls and the big stick. It's actually training people. If you've been in the industry, like me, nearly 50 years, I don't need to be trained in certain things, but many people that are entering do need training. They do need to be inducted into the industry, and where they haven't got the skills, they shouldn't be forced to take a ridiculous test that's expensive. They should be empowered by training and development. That's the way to treat people. That's the way to get the best way out of the industry. So I would say that with regard to the needs, first of all, you need to discuss the needs with operators. I had investors in people, I had National Training Awards, so I speak with some, and I was on the Sector Skills Council for training, helping to develop MVQ. And nobody has to teach me about training, but it's not regulation, or you've got to do this, or you've got to jump through all these hoops. You really do need to help human beings improve themselves. And that's been absent since it's in the Mayor's action plan that there would be training. It's training and development that's the key, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and putting people out of work by over-regulating them. So that's my method of doing things.
Give me an example of this over-regulation. Are we talking about the English test here? Or?
Well, I'd have to do the English test because sadly I can't produce any O-levels and what have you. And I managed to get on the TfL board and MBE, but I'd need to do the English test under the current rules. It's ridiculous. You need to be able to communicate in plain English. Many local authorities around the country need to communicate. There's no English test being applied to the black cabs. You don't need it. You need to be able to communicate. My school reports used to say talks a lot, but doesn't write things down so well. I don't need to do a written test. And we don't need tests set at entrepreneurial visa level. I mean, I'll just take you through this English thing. It started off as one thing. There was going to be grandfather rights. That got challenged in the courts. Then something else came in. I mean, it's been a nightmare. We're now entrepreneurial visa level to be a private hire driver. In the years I did 500,000 miles as a driver, the most I ever needed to do was actually write a receipt and put the date on it. That's the writing skills I need, and the tests need to be fit for purpose. And where people don't meet the standard, they need to be trained and not tested.
Okay, so you're clearly saying that this test is not fit for purpose.
Oh, it's absolutely not fit for purpose.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I agree. If you're going to have training, that's fine. But I think lessons need to be learnt from the English language regulation, and I'm afraid it was that its execution was lacking, in that it wasn't clear what drivers needed to do. It's created a lot of confusion. I think for a year, TfL themselves didn't know what certificates would satisfy this criteria. And I think something needs to be clear with a fairly long time frame to allow this to happen. I think nobody within the industry, I don't think, would have anything against development or training to a certain level, but it does need to be made clear and be properly executed.
You're saying despite all these extra people creating policy, this policy wasn't rolled out accurately. You weren't told what was going to happen and when it was happening. And drivers on the ground, are they still confused now? Has that improved?
I think they are. It's cleared up somewhat, because when I phone up TfL, I think they have a list of certificates which would be allowed to satisfy the criteria. In a previous life, I used to be an English teacher, so I know a wee bit about levels. And yes, it was. It took a year, literally, for that to be cleared up. I wouldn't art A level or an art GCSE be permissible.
Okay. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that safety of the passenger is key here. So that's the line. I think in terms of things like DBS checks, they're absolutely fundamental and key. So those things need to carry on. I think the English language issue, without sort of hammering a point, was poorly implemented, and I think that's the challenge. Is in principle, it's right that there should be, drivers should be able to communicate in English. How they then prove that, I think, is something that needs to be discussed. For example, Addison, we offer drivers an MVQ level 2 that they can take, and that's accredited by Pearson. They're independent. We still haven't had clearance from TfL as to whether that would qualify for the English language requirement. And I think the challenge with that is that we've now got another date that we're all working towards next year, and we'll end up in a similar situation to where we were this year before the date got extended, which is that there's a kind of bottleneck of getting drivers through that process, and that affects TfL from an administrative-based problem as much as it does us. I think one thing we've been lobbying for some time now is national standards for drivers, for operators, for vehicles, so that wherever you are in the country, there's a set of minimum standards everyone has to adhere to. Operates in the lorry or logistics industry. Why shouldn't it be something that exists in the private hire as well?
Just two other things I want to put on this particular point. Is there any evidence that the implementation of this test is forcing people out of the industry, people who can't pass, don't have the language skills, or just don't have the certificates? They may well be able to speak and write good English but don't have the certificates and can't bear the cost. Is there any evidence that people are now leaving?
Yes, there is. And in fairness to the political support we've had cross-party support on the difficulties here, and we have had 2 meetings with the Mayor now. Now, one of those meetings, the Chauffeur and Executive Association, a company called, the guy that works for them runs Carey worldwide. They operate in about 200 countries. He made the point that their best, most requested driver by all the big corporates, the Microsofts, the blue chip companies, was Portuguese. He cannot write a word in English, yet he's requested by the the big honchos in the corporates to drive them around, because he's absolutely an exemplary example of a driver that knows where he's going, knows how to be courteous and all the rest of it. The whole point about this is that people are being driven out of the industry. And we think that there's a big problem. The Mayor's postponed this twice. We don't think the problem's going away next February when he's offered to see us again, because we think next April there could be a loss of 15,000, 20,000 perfectly good people because their English skills don't meet entrepreneurial visa level. Well, they don't need that level to be able to be a driver. These people have often come from ethnic backgrounds who've been given a chance in life, and to put the big stick to them on the basis of they can't do this and they can't do that is wrong, when they're perfectly capable of doing the job and providing a service to the community. So that's the problem, and I don't think it's going to go away next April. I think we'll be sitting around with the Mayor saying, we've got the same problem, Mr. Mayor, because right at the beginning, TfL and the policymakers got this wrong.
You may not be able to answer this, Andrew, but is there a big disparity between your MVQ that you offer your drivers and this entrepreneurial level that is currently the regulation?
I'm not aware of that, actually. I'm not aware of the entrepreneurial level.
Well, the entrepreneurial visa level, of course, is above the visa level that you're required to get citizenship. It's just madness. The bar is set too high. Now, the problem was I don't know all the various examination qualifications, but they tried this one, and they tried that one, and they tried the other one. Really, there are local authorities outside of London that have proven worldwide English speaking tests and that assess their drivers with licensing officers. That's all you need to do. I asked a question at a compliance meeting the other week. How many compliance officers have found drivers out there that couldn't communicate in English? None was the answer. This is a massive, great big thing that's been put upon the industry. Somebody from the taxi industry suggested that half the industry couldn't speak English. It's just got no basis in fact. Most drivers can communicate. Yes, English may not be their first language, their English may not be perfect, but they're perfectly capable of understanding what to do, where to go to, how to deal with an emergency, and the whole thing is just not fit for purpose, and there's going to be problems next year without any shadow of doubt.
Okay, just to move on slightly, to talk about complaints, how do you as operators, particularly Andrew, you run a big operator, how do you deal with complaints about your drivers driving?
Obviously, it depends on the level of the complaint. So, in a very serious sort of accusation of, whether it's sexual assault or inappropriate behaviour by the driver, we would suspend the driver and then bring them in for an interview with us. So we've got a driver liaison team that works directly with the drivers. So we bring them in for an interview. We report through the TfL the 105 process as well, and then TfL investigate. So that's robust. Obviously, if it's a sort of misdemeanour in terms of a driving offence, we would speak to the driver and remind them of what their obligations are in terms of road safety and so on. But yeah, we've got a robust complaints process in place for serious issues. And TfL have just actually issued new guidance here in terms of reporting allegations to the police directly as well. So that's now running in parallel. So again, if there was an accusation of sexual assault or something very serious like that, we would also go through the process of informing the police in parallel with telling TfL rather.
So do you feel this is an issue for TfL? Do you feel like TfL are supporting you in this with proper guidance and easy communication?
Yeah, I think there's guidance there. I think they've got processes in place that we're satisfied with. I mean, it's always a challenge in these situations because it's often one person's word against another, and that needs to be addressed in a balanced way. But when it's an issue of passenger safety, we take it very seriously.
And how was I, as a passenger, I broadly ask this across the industry, how would I make a complaint? Is that, do your passengers know that? How do I identify the driver? Are these things simple to do, or is making a complaint quite complicated from a passenger's point of view?
So we have a customer relations team that passengers can call if they've got a complaint. There's also a direct operator line that they can call. I believe they can report directly to TfL as well. So I think there are a number of easily accessible channels.
Is that the norm across the industry, that it's quite easy to report?
So it's exactly the same in our company, and I would suggest any company worth its salt would be doing exactly the same. It's actually something I think TfL have taken a commonsensical view upon. I think it's correct.
Yeah, just to add to that, there is in the regulations a requirement to keep a complaint log book, which is inspected by the compliance visitors. Also, there is an option that's available to the customer. They can go to the operator, they can go to TfL, they can also go to the police. There's 3 ways that a passenger can make a complaint about a company. And I believe it's pretty robust. I've seen things encouraging, to put signs on, but everybody's booked with a company. If you have a problem with the driver, in my experience, I've not been an operator for a while, was the customers would ring you up. And I think all of our members, certainly it's part of our vetting process, that we check that they've got a robust complaints procedure in place, and actually it's already within regulations. So in a way, in a private hire vehicle, you've got far more options of dealing with a complaint than you have, say, in a black cab. that's just randomly driving around the street, because with private hire, you've booked with somebody. So you've got an immediate point of contact to make a complaint with.
Okay. And just my last question. How would you feel about improving standards for drivers, their employment standards, their training standards? Do you think that will drive up, improving conditions for them?
Caroline was doing that one.
Oh, sorry, Caroline. Excuse me.
Don't worry, so Caroline was going to lead on that a little bit. Don't worry, Sean.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd actually like to pick up on something that Sean was talking about just previously about complaints. I just wonder how you deal with complaints about poor driving that may have endangered people either crossing the road or cycling alongside. Do you feel that that process is working well? Do you have good processes for dealing with those kind of complaints, and do those kind of complaints ever come to you?
Absolutely, and I think social media is the most, is the most used vehicle, excuse the terminology for that. We certainly see a lot. If we do receive any complaints of that nature, they come in often through social media with a video, so we would be able to identify the driver. Again, we would speak to them about their poor driving if that were the case. So.
And do either of
most of our cars or our company cars have a front-facing camera, so they're checked if there's any complaint like this, so we can check their driving. And
do you think that works? I mean, do you think drivers, because they know that that camera is there, that can help them to concentrate?
I think maybe unconsciously it does. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Steve.
there's other things that take place nowadays that didn't take place when I was in the industry 20 years ago. For example, the telematics. Most companies track their vehicles now. So they know the speed of the vehicle, they know which route it took, and 1,000,001 other things. So you've actually got a complete and utter audit trail with a private hire operator, that if a complaint does come in, they can literally go and they can check the speed and everything, and they will generally always interview the driver. I mean, we had a policy in my company, which I sold in 1999, so pre-licensing, that we actually did a road test with every driver before we took them on. We also had mystery shoppers that travelled around to check out the driver's behaviour. Now, that's actually moved on now because you can do it remotely. You can check literally everything. I would say 90% of the operators in London have tracking that can give you the mile per hour, the speed. So it's really easy to do. It's much easier in private hire than it is in a taxi that's just randomly working by itself.
Yep.
The telematics has fantastically improved things.
Thank you. That's very useful. And then, sort of leading on from that, I know obviously none of you are representing any of the app-based operations, but for all of you as operators, do you have working conditions around pay and hours that people are working, so that people are not driving tired to be able to earn enough money to pay their rent and keep going? Do you have, I mean, are people working for you? Are they employed by you? Do they have or are they working by the job? And do you have a sense of how many hours someone is having to work in a week in order to take home a decent wage? Who wants to go first?
Go back to my company, having worked for London Underground as an apprentice for 5 years, I clocked in. So I clocked in and out every single driver. Now again, the technology enables us and the modern company to actually have a complete and utter record of not only drivers' earnings, but the amount of hours that they've done. And we work within safe bounds of hours driving. Very much on hours driving, which was recently discussed with the Department for Transport, because there is a lot of rest periods for private hire drivers, because they'll stop and they'll park and they won't be driving. So the tiredness factor isn't the same as somebody that's constantly driving. All of that's very closely monitored, and again, technology enables you to do that. With regard to pay, driver has a choice. I chose to be a self-employed driver, which meant I could go on holiday for Sweden, I could come in at what time of the morning I wanted to. I had 3 months in Italy and I did various things. I could come and go as I please. That's an option that's available to drivers. Other drivers may choose to have the fixed hours option and work for a company and have employment. But predominantly, most people, due to their social needs, they may have children to pick up from school and various other difficult things, or social requirements of relatives and what have you, choose to have the flexibility. And if you choose the flexibility, you don't get with that, as I did, the same rights as being employed. But there is a clear choice available, and there are adverts in our magazine for both types of people. This sweatshop thing that's bandied around all the time isn't my experience. We've got people advertising our magazine guaranteeing £1,000 a week in earnings. So it's a bit of a misnomer. I think what has happened is the app-only companies, as I refer to them, have actually come in and they charge heavy commissions. They put the prices down to the ground. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if you choose to work for that sort of company, you're going to struggle to earn a living. Mm-hmm. So it's a trade-off as to what you want. If you're prepared to commit yourself to regular hours, you can earn a very decent living. Otherwise, people wouldn't be in the industry.
Mm-hmm. And so you find that people who have opted for the flexible option, if they're working for an operator that has people at the end of a phone to take bookings and a sort of more a non-app or not totally app-based operation, you in your experience, those workers are able to kind of take home enough money without having to work very excessive hours.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
Who wants to? Robert, do you want to?
Yeah, one doesn't want a tired driver working for you. So we kind of look out for a driver who's maybe done a few hours and watch them and ask them maybe to go home if they've done more than enough hours, because you don't want a driver working excessive hours. And again, I think that on the payment front, one tries to you want happy drivers, so you want them to be earning. So you're not. So if a driver isn't happy and isn't earning, they have the choice to go somewhere where they can earn more. If you see what I mean.
Yes, although
I guess it's a free market, but as a company, one wishes all your drivers to be happy.
And so, do you actually have limits on how many hours drivers can work in order that people are not driving tired? Or
yes,
you do.
Yep.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, so we're predominantly self-employed model that we use with drivers. We do have some that prevents people enjoying the flexibility that they do under, say, the self-employment model.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, I think as much as... Sorry, is that better? Yeah. As much as possible, I think any company wishes their drivers to be happy. So, as a company, one tries their very best to make all your drivers as happy as possible. Mm-hmm. So, if, for example, yes, they are absent or ill or whatever, a deal is usually done with the driver as regards vehicles, and overall the emphasis is very much on making drivers happy, and that is by earning and having a fair work to life balance.
I just have one point that I think latest figures show that 1/3 of vehicles being used in private hire are now hired. Now, you can hire a vehicle without the commitment of putting the vehicle round your neck on a weekly basis now. It's widespread. So you're not locked into the vehicle. If you do happen to have an illness, you can get the vehicle collected and you're out of the cost of the vehicle. I think it's fake news by certain people that everybody's on the poverty line and they've all got these vehicles on 3-year contracts. It's not the case. In many cases where the vehicle is owned over a 3-year period, obviously the payments are over a 3-year period if it's owned by the driver. But generally where they're leased by the company, certainly when I was in operating, if a driver fell ill, they stopped paying the rental on the lease. And that's quite commonplace throughout the sector. You're not going to bankrupt a driver who's an asset because he's got an illness. And I think there's a lot of misinformation about this and about the actual way that the cars are engaged. It's changed because of the entrant of the app-only companies. There are now more and more options for the way you take your vehicle. Now, if you're foolish enough, when you've not tried the job, to take a 3-year contract, I think that would be madness, because you can do it weekly, you can do it monthly.
Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you. Let's move on looking at ride-sharing services. Joanne.
Yes, I want to ask about ride-sharing services, and they are particularly offered by app operators such as Uber and ViaVan, for example, where technology allows you to put in your destination. If people are going in a similar way, you can share the cost of a journey. I've looked at the Addison app. I don't see that you offer that at all. Is that something that is likely to be more widespread in future, and should TfL be encouraging that?
It's not something we offer as a service at the moment. We have actually been looking into the sort of the details of doing that, if you like. So we actually recently led a consortium, a government-funded consortium from the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles. It's called Merge Greenwich, and it was looking at autonomous vehicle ride sharing. But we did some particular consumer views and consumer surveys and attitudes towards ride sharing in itself. And I think there are a number of challenges still to look at. So I think TfL need to regulate it if they're going to go ahead with it, and they need to work with the industry, but other groups as well on the actual impacts of ride sharing. I think safety is still the key concern there. I think particularly, we found in our consumer research that particularly for women, I think that's a concern. And I think there are cultural aspects to this in terms of, people are willing to get on the tube and be in very close proximity to each other and, not talk to each other and so on, because that's something that's, grown over time, and, it's just an embedded cultural norm. Getting into a much smaller space with a stranger is a totally different situation. And there's a safety aspect, but there's a social aspect, and what time of day it is. If it's at night and it's post witching hour, what does that mean? So I think there's lots of different aspects that need to be looked into. And it's not just whether the technology allows it. There's lots of cultural and safety issues to look into first.
For both the customers and the driver.
Absolutely,
as well.
yeah. I mean, interestingly, our work found even moving into an autonomous world that the customer will always want some kind of authority figure, safety steward in the vehicle to provide that kind of that assurance and that safety, that if there are any safety concerns, they're able to speak to someone or get someone's attention. And I think that's particularly important in, like I say, in a very closed space that you might be sharing with a stranger.
Okay, so you're not planning to introduce it anytime soon?
Like I said, we've been looking into it, but I think it's quite limited at the moment, and I think primarily because of the cultural and safety issues. Yeah.
Thank you. Steve?
Yes, I'm quite experienced on ride sharing, because the Department for Transport, or DOT as it used to be, when you were at Marsham Street, invited me to beta test it a little bit and let them know my thoughts. I had an office in Harrow that had a pub a few doors away, and we tried to match people to go in joint journeys because of the supply. Passengers assaulting passengers, girls being assaulted by boys, Arsenal footballers want to beat up the Tottenham supporter that's got in the car with them. It's a very complex thing, managing different people on a different logistical journey to get them to a place on time. Now, having said that, of course, we must try to endeavour not to reject the concept of ride sharing, but it's very limited. It's not a panacea, it's not easy to do. There's who pays the fare, why were you keeping me late, and all the rest of it. There's lots of challenges in ride sharing. Now, we have a very good company that's also a tech company. It's a member, but it's a traditional operator called Split Cab, who do a fantastic job of ride sharing. Now, if you get the chance to go and see Split Cab, or you want me to arrange you to go and do that, they've got ride sharing off to a T, because they do many airport transfers and they go 90% out with a 90% back coverage. Now, that's where ride sharing works. They take bookings that are 4 hours in advance. Instant ride sharing is extremely problematic, and it can be a danger to the passenger and to the driver. All sorts of issues on fare dispute, who pays for what. It's not that easy to do, and what I think we've learned from other countries is you have to be careful that it doesn't undermine the buses and the taxis and the structured public transport, and becomes a sort of cheap alternative that's actually got no controls and checks and measures on it at all. So I would invite you to, if you would like to have a look at the split cab, they have got it off to perfection, and they've been doing it for years.
Perhaps knowing that, and Andrew talked about TfL needing to regulate, how have they done that to ensure that people can complain, people can be barred from...
Well, they're licensed private hire operators, but their ride-sharing model is geared around pre-bookings and logistics, where the agreement is all made before you put the people in the car together at 11 o'clock at night, when they're full up with lager and goodness only knows what. It's problematic putting individuals in a car together that are total strangers. Now, if they're going to an airport or a journey like that, a pre-planned journey, logistically it's easier to manage, and it can be done. And they've got a policy, if they only get one person for the ride, they will take them, but they'll try and get 7 or 8 people for the ride. And where this is done, it's good, but ride sharing isn't a panacea that offers up a lot of solutions. I can promise you, DOT, as it was at the time, looked at it at the time and realised how problematic it was. And we tried it with these passengers that used to come out of the pub. It was an absolute nightmare, I can promise you. So ride sharing is welcomed, but it needs to be structured. But it isn't a solution to, you can lock everything together and make it easy, because one piece of traffic can make the next passenger's journey late, miss an appointment. There's all sorts of issues that follow it. I just wanted to flag that.
So that's really useful, and it's a real shame that Uber aren't here, actually, because we could have asked them if they have increased complaints over their pool sharing, for example, to get some data. But Steve, you mentioned about the conflict with bus services, and we do know, for example, that Ford's Chariot service is aiming to be a operate on a pool share basis, but TfL has classed it as a bus because it's a larger vehicle and so forth. Do you see the same issues with that?
I think it's less prevalent. I mean, again, with my time with Go Skills, on the agenda was looking at making journeys more effective where there weren't major bus routes, and having local services, particularly to rural areas and what have you, that could manage that. But it's quite challenging doing it, and it's very difficult to be cost effective. And often these services, when they were trialled out in the provinces 10-15 years ago, were very, very unviable financially and needed heavy subsidy. Now, if somebody's going to do that commercially, it's going to be a challenge. So I can't have the crystal ball, but I know where it's been looked at before. Again, it's not that easy.
In the regulatory framework, do you think they would be different between private hire vehicles to bus services, which is how TfL have defined that Chariot scheme, for example?
Yes, it depends on the size of the vehicle, because there's a triple raft of regulation. There's bus and coach at the top end, there's PSV in the middle for the over 12-seater to 20, and then there's PHV, 9 and less type of thing. And those things are separately regulated. In the DFT committee that I've just been sitting on, that's been looking at national regulations, has recognised that there's a mismatch between, for example, the criminal record checking on a PSV and the criminal record checking on a coach. And all of these things need to be aligned a great deal so that everything is under the regulatory umbrella. And it may not be that these Chariot services fit into if they're above 8 seats, they're going to fit into PSV, and an entirely different set of regulations.
Okay, that's something we can explore further. Thank you. I don't know if anybody else wanted to add anything.
I mean, I think again, this modelling came through in our merge work. I guess the ultimate desire is to try and move people from private vehicles, their own private vehicles, into sort of more of a mobility as a service type model, rather than shifting people from buses into those models. So I think that's where TfL will need to be careful in how they regulate, because that's clearly we don't want to encourage more private independent vehicle use.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move on to look at the issue of congestion. Tom.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so my question is, to what extent is the private hire sector affected by traffic congestion? And more importantly, what do you think the Mayor should do about it? So we'll start with Andrew this time.
Absolutely. Well, see, the consultation on the proposal to remove the exemption for the congestion charge has just closed. So we submitted, we also had some independent economic analysis undertaken by Auxera. Hopefully that's publicly available, hopefully you've seen that. But I think there are three key issues here. Firstly, the evidence that was provided by TfL and the assumptions that that evidence led to were fairly flawed, I think, and I know that sort of came through in the debate that you had where you voted against the exemption. But also the proposals may well increase congestion and may well make air quality poorer in the zone and around the zone. So I think there are three.
So is that by pushing cars just outside the zone?
Yeah. So the evidence that came through from SEPA that TfL used assumed that there'd be this specialisation, particularly with the large operator and the extra large operator. I think we were the large operator and Uber were the extra large operator. Now, from our point of view, we don't operate in a way that we would sort of take, say, for example, 10% of our fleet and specialise and put it into the congestion charge zone, because a lot of our journeys are longer. We go into the zone, but we will always have a passenger that we're dropping off or picking up, but then they'll go out on a longer journey to, say, Heathrow, for example. The concept of specialisation suggests that driver would then have to come all the way back in to fulfil a job in the zone. Clearly that model doesn't work, and you end up with a suboptimal allocation system. So that 45% figure, that 45% reduction in unique entries we think is flawed, and there was no quantitative evidence to back that up. So I think we immediately have a concern with that. Once you question that, it kind of knocks over the rest of the proposal, because the idea that would then lead to a 1% reduction in overall traffic in the zone is flawed, because the 45% is flawed. And we actually found that what you might find is that people are encouraged to sort of hover around the outside of the zone, looking for work, so it would increase congestion around there. It's likely that in terms of air quality, it would actually push, just say specialisation occurred, it would push passengers into other vehicles, like licensed taxis, for example, which TfL zone figures show are older in average, so they're more highly emitting. So you then have a kind of a poorer air quality issue that's going on. So from our point of view, the proposals don't deal with congestion or air quality. We've been very supportive of the shift towards zero emission capable vehicles. We're on line to meet the ULEZ zone requirements and also the zero emission capable requirements. I think the problem is that by kind of putting this sort of tax on the industry, it starts removing potential investment into kind of cleaning up our fleet. We don't operate any vehicle in our fleet beyond 3 years, so we've got a regular turnover of vehicles. So we're always looking to find those new vehicles that are cleaner. So yeah, I mean that's the main issue with the proposals as they've been presented.
The Mayor's calling to be given the powers to cap numbers. Yeah. What's your view on that?
Again, I mean, in principle, I don't see that would reduce congestion. I mean, the detail's not there. So where would the cap be? I suppose is the question in the first instance, because it's just not clear what the right place to position that cap is. So
in terms of how many licenses?
Yeah, I think you need to understand.
We're not going to issue any more licenses.
You need to understand there are different size operators. Is it going to be proportional based on that? But I mean, even the Competitions and Market Authority have provided a view on this, and they think that it would actually reduce the passenger options. So I think it's always looking at competition in the market and the passenger experience, and their view on capping is it would actually damage the consumers.
But do you accept that PHVs do contribute to congestion, and therefore one has to balance up the passenger choice with, the Mayor has a responsibility to balance that with other considerations like air quality, like congestion that affects buses and other road users?
Yeah. Obviously there's this congestion and it's been increasing. That's not just private hire, that's across the board. So I think there needs to be a balance found there. But I think the approach of sort of crude things like putting a cap on the numbers or taking the exemption away aren't necessarily the ways to deal with it. As I said earlier, something like maybe looking at national standards, you may well find that if you introduce national standards, that kind of naturally reduces the numbers of drivers and vehicles and operators in the industry.
Robert, your thoughts on this?
I agree very much with with a lot of what Andrew had to say. I think maybe capping numbers or charging PHV drivers maybe isn't the answer, but perhaps changing how PHV drivers work in certain ways. For example, starting empty in central London as opposed to having a job which takes them to central London. That changing the way they work, that would reduce congestion quite quickly, I would have thought. I also
how practically can that be done? So is that something the sector needs to do, or the mayor needs to sort of get involved?
For example, at the moment, I think TfL are sending letters quite correctly to the owners of vehicles if they've noticed that they've entered the centre of London, but just asking, were you working, or why were you there? That's a good way of starting, to try and change behaviour of certain drivers for certain companies. I also obviously think the amount of deliveries in London, when we're talking about careers and other forms have also contributed quite greatly to congestion at present, and if there's a way we can work, I know sort of, because I talk with Low City quite a bit, and there's ideas about 24-hour deliveries and spreading out traffic so that it's not just concentrated in rush hours. And
that is something we've looked at on the committee, actually.
Yeah. I think it's heading towards a holistic answer.
Steve?
Yeah, just to say that TfL already has at its disposal the ability to deal with private hire vehicles that are allegedly coming into the centre. Now, it's called honeypot. Bees go to the honeypot. So what happens with the app companies, because they're not working with traditional companies, the way they work is they show themselves where they think the work's going to be. So as a consequence of that, they are entering, without any shadow of a doubt, the congestion charge zone without a job, on speculation. TfL is in control of the congestion charge cameras, and as a mode that's exempt, it can be dealing with those people because they shouldn't be doing that. So there is a mechanism that's far better than the sledgehammer of congestion charging everybody and penalising all the disabled and the other vulnerable groups that need to use the cheapest door-to-door mode of transport, which is private hire vehicles. If TfL engaged with us before putting out the consultation, we'd have discussed this with them. But they didn't. They just said, here's the proposal, this is what we're going to do. And it's flawed because there are better solutions out there. A couple of other things just to mention. You asked for some improvements in your question. Better design of cycle lanes. The design of them has been very questioned. Making them one way at certain times of day and taking up less road space, just in future design. Thinking about innovative ways. Better parking facilities, because most of the traffic in London is looking for parking, and if you go round all the boroughs in London, there are more and more yellow lines appearing for revenue reasons, creating more and more traffic. People need to get the revenue for the parking and make more parking available. Parking, having no parking as a deterrent doesn't work. Better use of road space, sharing road between day and night, between residents and business, a restriction on delivery times. A brilliant job was done in the Olympics to make that happen. Let's take that forward. Rob's alluded to it. Absolutely. Let's make the times of deliveries when there isn't the congestion, and harsher penalties on the utilities that overrun. I mean, when I was on the TfL board, it dismayed me that BT were going to be fined £3,000 for violating a street for 2 weeks. I mean, it's just beyond belief. These people are multi-million businesses. It's petty cash to them to overrun, and as we all know, they overrun constantly. We need to get DfT and government and right across the piece getting up those things. The congestion charge proposal, rather than go through that now, we've sent in a substantive proposal on that may I send that to committee so you can look at that to save you some
yours as
time?
well, please. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to sort of finally, I mean, what longer term, one thing that's being looked at is road pricing, which you know would be much wider than congestion charge and cover probably the whole of Greater London. Do you think that? I mean, do you think that's something that would be effective, or do you think it depends on what system is brought in?
It has to be, if it's managed properly and designed properly from the get-go. London is only going to get more crowded, more congested. So everybody that's involved with that process needs to work out ways and means of utilising the road space better. As a mode of public transport ourselves, it takes many, many non-ambulant people around, people to hospitals and people to essential things for essential travel in a door-to-door mode. Yes, we accept that there is going to be the need to do road pricing and what have you. I think it's an inevitability. I'm sure the DFT are nailed onto it. And it makes sense to do it. So we'd be supportive on that, but what we'd say is engage with us as how we can make it work best for us.
Do you share that view, Robert?
Yeah, I think with road pricing, obviously this debate's been going on for a long time on road pricing generally, particularly sort of revenue goes down for government. But I think it's quite crude the way it's been put forward at the moment, and I think that there's technology enables much smarter use of roads and much smarter, I think, incentives actually. I think incentives is a way to shift congestion and traffic patterns, and I think that's the sort of direction that anyone looking at road pricing should be going in, rather than just a crude kind of you'll pay £10 to go into this area. You have to look at the M6 toll to see it's effectively got an empty road that doesn't pay back. You know, so I think there are sort of challenges there, and I just think we've got the technology to do these things much smarter, and I think that's the direction we should be going in.
Robert, just last word on road pricing.
I'd agree, but I think obviously I think it needs to be a solution for London, so it can't just happen in one borough. So I think the boroughs have to work together.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now I've got a queue of people wanting to come in on this one. Before I do that, can I welcome students here from Forest Hill School in Lewisham? Welcome. We're the Transport Committee at the London Assembly, and today we're looking at taxi and private hire services in London. We're hearing from the industry today, and our future meetings will be hearing from other groups, including Transport for London, people who run buses in London, cyclists and pedestrians. So welcome along today. I think we've got another group from your school coming in an hour, so I will be welcoming them again shortly. Right, I've got Florence, Caroline and Sean.
I'm just mindful of the time, so I'll keep it quite brief, Chair, but you all talked about, in response to Tom's question, where you don't feel that capping is the way forward, but undoubtedly the figures are there to say that we have seen a massive increase. I think an increase of 93% since 2009-10 to 2017-18 in the number of private hire vehicles across London. And again, I'm sure you've all seen that in New York they've introduced the 12-month cooling off period, which, you know, it's still quite early to test that because it was August. Mm-hmm. So if we were to get the package of measures in terms of some of the standards you'd want TfL to adopt, and would you and they were to turn around and say, actually, let's do something like New York and see if a 12-month or 6-month cooling off period would help to reduce traffic and congestion, would you welcome that?
I think I'd take the approach that I alluded to earlier, that you really need to stop the app-only companies coming into central London, and you can deal with that. It's fake news, these numbers. I've raised this time and time again with TfL. The numbers of people licensed are significantly higher, but the numbers that are actually working, when you look at them, are not that much different from 10 years ago. Okay. You know, we keep getting told about an active driver. An active driver on the publicity in the media is a driver that's got a licence. Many of them have left, many of them have gone abroad, many of them have died. There's all sorts of things, and they're still kept on as active drivers. Okay. When you look at the real numbers, it's near to 60, 70,000, which isn't far short of what there was when we started licensing process up. Yes, it's increased. I would suggest it's increased 10, 15%, but it hasn't increased by the regularly numbers. And you can deal with these people coming into central London. You have the mechanism via the congestion charge to penalise them for coming into London without a job. You can stop this. It's in your own hands. So that's the measure I would focus on.
Okay. Thank you.
Just put the figures. The latest figures we've got, there are 87,921 licensed private hire vehicles at the moment, and 113,645 licensed private hire drivers. That's considerable numbers.
Yes, the numbers are high, but a lot of those vehicles are actually owned by fleets. They're not on the road, they're not working. They're accident management companies. I mean, there are 10 times the amount of accident management companies now. And as soon as the driver has an accident, he gets about 10 phone calls from all of these companies. So a lot of these vehicles are not physically working. And if you compare the numbers now to what they were, yes, it's increased. But the problem is that it hasn't increased by the numbers that are there. There is a problem, and I think the problem of people coming into central London is caused by app-only companies letting their drivers honeypot and coming to work on speculation. That's what you need to address.
Thank you.
Okay, Caroline.
Thank you. I wanted to welcome what Andrew said earlier about smarter road pricing, and it's really welcome. We've had bus companies and to have private hire operators welcoming that as a solution. That's really positive. I also wanted to pick up on the point about using space better on our roads and the comments about cycle lanes. Having cycled to City Hall this morning, just seeing the numbers of people who were being moved along the road, cycling south on the north-south route down Farringdon Road, it is phenomenal how many people are moving per minute compared to the numbers of people who are moving on the roads. I can see absolutely that one might want to be thinking on over crossing Blackfriars Bridge of having a lane that was for taxis and buses and one for the other vehicles. But actually these cycle lanes are part of the solution. They are helping us to move people around our city, and in the light of the IPCC report yesterday that implies that we have to really speed up in terms of bringing our carbon emissions down from transport, then actually we need to be doing everything possible to keep those bike lanes there. So I just wanted to...
You want to put a point there, it's not a question. Yeah, okay, I understand. Thank you, Caroline. Sean, you wanted to come in.
Just two things. You talked about road pricing I'm focusing on here. You talked about a solution for all of London, but what will that do to the outskirts of London? I live, like some members do, right up against the border of London. How would that work? Is it a good or a bad thing that we'd have a separate road pricing thing from everybody else? And also the privacy issues about road pricing. So you talked about smarter technology. I'm assuming that means some kind of box in my car, somebody tracking where I'm going. For me, the jury's out on road pricing. I could go one way or the other, but one of my biggest concerns is the idea that somebody, effectively the Treasury, correct me if I'm wrong, would know where I am every minute of the day. That makes me uncomfortable. So what's your issues there?
People already do.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I have a choice. But this difference is I have a choice. I have a choice, and Apple don't get to send me a tax bill. So it's an entirely different thing.
They might know already. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think this. I haven't got the complete answer to this. I think this is where you look at. There are lots of different. There's like license plate recognition. I don't think it necessarily means that you have to have a box that follows you around everywhere in the vehicle. But I think the first point is key is making sure that if you do put a road pricing scheme and a smart one in place, it doesn't then have unintended consequences outside of that zone. I think that's one of the concerns we're seeing with some of the clean air zones that have been brought into some of the boroughs, is that may well impact on the roads around in terms of air quality and congestion. So I think absolutely it needs to be something that I think actually probably needs to be looked at nationally first,
yes.
and then worked down in terms of and I don't mean in a kind of very hierarchical way, but in a kind of sort of dialogue, but something that there needs to be some kind of national approach to probably road pricing first, and then what that means in specific areas, urban, suburban, rural.
Yes, sorry Sean, that was my point. I think because they've got the recent scheme in Hackney Shoreditch, which seems great, but it's just one road in one area. What does that tell us about the effect on all of London? I think when these schemes are thought of, it should include the whole of London, so that there's a solution for the whole of London, as opposed to just one street in one area, which doesn't maybe tell us too much about the effect of it.
Yeah, I'm on the same page, because it's probably me that got you guys the job as TfL, because the powers that be of the day wanted the London boroughs to control taxi and private hire in the 32 boroughs. That was the proposal that was on the table. And I remember having the conversation with Jenny Tong, George Young and Glenda Jackson about why it should be under one body. And this is exactly the same thing. If everybody's doing their own thing, it's like the TLRN, 5% of the London road network. We know the problems that causes. We know the problems that causes with electric vehicle infrastructure and all the other things. For me, it is, I'm very proud to say that one of the things I got through on the DFT report that's just going to Chris Grayling at the moment is the fact that they're now going to consider outside of London modelling the private hire and taxi regime on having boroughs working collectively and collaboratively. To me, this will be the key with road pricing as well. You can't do this in isolation. I'm going up to Manchester in a few weeks' time to talk to the political people out there. In fact, John Lamont, who was with TfL, who sorted out tube lines to TfL, is up there. I'm speaking at a conference with him. And very much I'm going to be talking about the need for engagement with the trade and working collaboratively, not through individual boroughs and hamlets and crooks and small entities, but collectively. Because the GLA works, TfL works as an entity for joining things up. If borough by borough, local democracy is great, but on big ticket issues like road pricing, it really does need to be metropolitan authorities that control them.
Agreed.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Let's move on to our final section, this bit, and that's on enforcement. Keith, you're leading on it.
Thank you very much. Good morning. So, first question, I might as well go with you first, Steve, if that's okay. Do you think TfL have got the right safety measures and enforcement in place to prevent illegal minicab activity?
I think there's plenty of street enforcement out there, and the police, of course, are empowered to do that. What I would say is that we feel it's not necessarily being targeted in the right places, because I went to see an inspection at Heathrow the other week. The enforcement people are doing a fantastic job there, but there is a sort of over amount. When they come up with 250 enforcement officers, they really need to be targeted in certain areas where the problems are. I don't think you need the number and the volume of enforcement people that you've got, particularly the ones that are only trained to do basic things. I think you've got an elite team. There definitely needed to be more, but I think the cost of the enforcement is quite expensive, and sometimes they're asking people to do things that are impossible, and they've got more powers than the police, which is a bit worrying, because they want you to carry spare bulbs, for example, and actually that's a futile exercise because you need a trade engineer to change bulbs in modern cars. So carrying them and putting you off the road for not having them is just an act of futility. If you haven't got a bulb that's out, you need the 7 days that the police give you to get, or you get your licence off. But generally, the enforcement is very, very good. But I would question the absolute multi-million-pound cost of all the compliance officers for what has been a very compliant industry. Again, I think that there's this measure been put in place to deal with app companies that doesn't apply to the rest of us, because we're already fantastically compliant. There are very, very few serious misdemeanours amongst the licensed industry, and it's been that way for years. It's a very compliant industry.
You say that, and I'm not questioning you, but I did go out with the enforcement team about a year ago, and I was only there a short while, and there were people who didn't have licences, there were people with false licences stuck on their cabs. We actually closed the cab office. That was in all a matter of 1.5 hours. So, I accept that the vast majority of cab people are compliant, but for all that to happen in the space of 1.5 hours, it wasn't fixed. It was just a routine check, and yet there was a number of private hire cabs that were pulled over for misdemeanours, and a cab office closed.
Yeah,
they looked to me like they needed to have those enforcement officers.
If you look at the stats, which we see every quarter on the amount of cab offices closed, it's a rarity. I can assure you, I get the compliance meetings, go to the quarterly compliance meetings. Now, you mentioned people that are committing cab offences. They're not in our industry. They're crooks. And they're maligned to be in our industry as private hire drivers. They're not. You just mentioned false stickers. They're not in our industry. They're nothing to do with our industry. They are crooks that are outside of our industry. And they affect us, they affect the black cabs, and they, of course, compromise the safety of the public.
But then don't you need the enforcement officers to catch the crooks then?
You absolutely do, but whether you need the number is questionable, and whether the multi-million-pound budget, because I don't see a great deal of difference between the 200 million that's been set aside for the next few years, when the industry's been actually operating on far lower figures with almost the same results. I don't see a spectacular increase in the amount of compliance issues at all. In fact, you could, on the compliance side, I mean, we are complied as a private hire industry, and the taxi industry is far less compliant because you've got the scandal of the 1,296 MOTs that were found in 2016. They didn't have the second MOT. Where's the compliance on that? Their offices aren't checked to the same levels as ours do. We would suggest there needs to be a balance, and we're very, very supportive of the compliance team. I've met with them for the last 20 years on a quarterly basis, and it's a rarity for cab offices to be shut down. It's a rarity. It does happen, and where it happens, it should happen, but I question the cost of the compliance. It's very heavy on the industry.
Add to that, Robert?
I'm in agreement with Steve. It seems a lot of money to be paying for, and the fact that it's private hire operators paying for it, and it seems to be quite a lot of money. However, our experiences with the team when our drivers have met them has been positive.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the enforcement's important for the safety of passengers and the public and the drivers. But I think this is something I've talked about, the idea of national standards already, and I think this is a key area that the enforcement needs to be widened in the sense of, if you had national standards that were recognised across all authorities, you had a national database of drivers and operators, and then you allowed enforcement officers in other authorities to enforce people who are drivers or operators who are licensed in other authorities. That would really improve issues, because at the moment clearly that's something that sort of prevents sort of thorough enforcement across the country.
Well, on that, we have this issue around cross-border hiring. Do you want to just touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think cross-border hiring is a step too far in the same way that capping is. I think it's in terms of addressing these issues, I think national standards, maybe a national certificate of sort of professional competence for drivers, and then that national database and that ability to enforce across the country, across borders, would be enough to deal with those issues. It would bring any of those authorities that are licensing perhaps in a slightly sort of unsafe way to have to meet a higher set of standards, and it would just bring kind of alignment across everything. I think in terms of the issue of cross-border, and obviously it's an issue for Addison because we're a UK-wide company, is that there are almost 300 licensing authorities around the country. You have to license in every one, and they all have different standards at the moment. It would be a kind of a very complex situation, and it would prevent kind of a service being provided to passengers who want to go beyond that border. I know there are different proposals on how that might be modelled. I think one thing that is welcome here, and perhaps it's something that would help mitigate, is as you obviously got TfL and Transport for Greater Manchester starting to look to align standards. If you start getting maybe some regionalisation and some alignment there, that's something that might help mitigate that. But I think broadly, cross-border is just a step too far in terms of regulation.
An issue that brought to my attention though was Southend Council banned an operator, but then they got a licence from TfL and then just went back into Southend. Steve, do you want to comment on that?
I mean, that's something we work with Professor Mohammed Al-Haq on the national standards. There should be a national database so that misdemeanours, vehicle logs, who they're licensed by, etc., is national. That's one of the key recommendations that would eliminate that. But the other thing, that there's a lot of misunderstanding between what is a cross-border hiring and what's out-of-area working. For example, I lived in Bushey for a period of my life, and I used to travel to Watford. Well, technically, if I booked a Bushey company under some of the proposals, this ABBA proposal, and I got a job to Watford, I wouldn't be able to travel to Garston with the same company. The car would come back empty. There's a difference between, companies, particularly the ones in the suburbs that work on the edge of other borders, of restrictive practices. The big problem is what's called out-of-area working. Now, This is where the app companies are causing the problem, because an app company, I now live outside of London in Bovingdon in Hertfordshire, and I get the app company's driver sitting in the village from Luton. Well, that should be prohibited, and you can prohibit that with technology by geofencing. Really should only be able to operate and pick up unless it's a pre-booking that you're sent to. You shouldn't be able to show yourself for hire like a taxi. And it's out of area working, not cross-border hiring that's a problem. And I've written about this several times, and I've written to the committee, and when I saw the policy document from TfL, I thought, you're not getting what the problem is. TfL drivers shouldn't be working from an app in Reading, Southend, Brighton, Timbuktu or wherever. That's what's happening. They should be geo-fenced by the app company not to work out of the area they're licensed in.
There's one example. I believe TfL actually licensed somebody in Liverpool.
Well, they've got them licensed all over the country. Apparently, it doesn't matter where you live, you can get a licence. Yeah. I did suggest that was potty, but I was told by TfL at a meeting they couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah, mad. Okay, so moving on then. You and I had a lot of discussions actually around the new licensing fee structure. And I know there was some modification to it, but where do you stand on that now?
It's a catastrophe. It's bankrupting business, it's constraining business, it's only allowing big offshore companies into the sector now, and ultimately it's going to damage not only the private hire trade but the taxis. The fees are not fit for purpose. You can't tell me that a fee for a 100-car company that was £2,800 is now £500,000 is a sensible move. If TfL were short of money, they should have did what Addison Lee actually suggested and charged the company by the number of drivers they have on their books. Because the big app company is paying a pittance per driver and the small good companies are paying a fortune. Now, we've got a member that operates in a tough part of town in the Streatham and Brixton area. Great. Traditionally at Christmas, they move from 80 to 120 drivers. To have done that, if they'd increased to 101 drivers, it would have cost them £54,000. It's not fit for purpose. It's a tragedy, and we're going to go back to TfL and ask them to rethink on this. Because it's breaking people, it's damaging competition, and it's only allowing multi-great big offshore from Estonia and all places in the ex-Soviet bloc to come in here and operate with money from where? It's undermining everybody, the bus industry, the taxi industry and the private hire industry. These fees are simply not fit for purpose and they're not reasonable.
So from that, I can assume you quite like it then, is that right? No.
So, sorry to be so frank.
The way...
Brutally frank.
Yeah, the way I looked at it is these ridiculous cliff edges. And it's retrogressive. As you say, if you're a small company, you're penalised. And if you're a big app company, I remember looking at figures whereby it went from something like £200 per cab, then £300, then 175, then 200. Then when it got to the big companies, it was £75 per cab. There's no logic to it.
Let me just put one other thing to you that not many people realised. There are several tiers that have been set up by TF, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, so on and so forth. Every time you move between tiers, you've got to reapply for your licence.
Really?
And there's a great question on the licence application form. You need to be of one mastermind to be able to answer it. It's how many drivers do you think you will have in the duration of your 5-year licence? Now, when I started, I had none. And during my running the company, it varied between 0 and 120 at various times. If I dropped down a tier, I'd have to reapply for my licence. Yeah. The system is beyond anything. It's absolutely beyond anything.
It is truly ridiculous. I think I've got one more question. And no, I think we've probably covered that. So it's fine. Okay.
Lovely, thank you. I think that brings our first half of the meeting to a close. Thank you very much, Steve, Robert and Andrew, for your evidence today. Please do send us your submissions on the recent consultation. If there are other things that you'd wanted to raise today, I know, Robert, particularly you do some work with cleaner vehicles. If you want to submit some evidence around that, we'd be very interested to read that. So thank you very much. We're going to swap panels now. And whilst we're waiting for our black taxi representatives to come forward, members, can I just suggest we do some of the other business on the agenda whilst we swap over? So could I suggest, so item 6, London Travel Watch budget bid, just to put on record that the business plan should have been alongside this, but it was not in a suitable state. So I have written back to the Chair of Travel Watch outlining concerns. We're asked to agree the budget. Can I suggest this wording, members? That the committee recommends to the London Assembly a provisional budget for London Travel Watch for 1920 based on the figures set out in Appendix 1 to the report, noting that the final 1920 budget for London Travel Watch is subject to the committee's endorsement of a satisfactory London Travel Watch business plan for the 1920 period.
Happy with that, yep.
Have members happy to agree that?
Agree.
Lovely, thank you very much. And then can we go to item 7, our Transport Committee work programme? Can we agree the remainder of our programme for the year? Note the response from the Mayor and TfL to our report on cycling infrastructure, and delegate to myself, in consultation with party group lead members, to agree a response to the TfL consultations on changes to the Central London bus networks and changes to London service permit guidance. Lovely, thank you very much indeed. Right, let's just wait for our next panel of guests to come down. So we've got Alan Miller, Steve McNamara, Trevor. My eyesight's failing me here. Trevor
I think they're going the wrong
Mick
way.
Walker.
I think they've gone out. I think they've gone. Oh no, this is one coming down here now.
You can come around this way. So.
Yeah. Do you want to help our guests come down, please?
They're coming there, right? You're on their way.
That's my eyesight, isn't it? The Merralls. It's awful, isn't it?
GLA, chamber, sound. 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 GLA, chamber.
Morning, welcome to our second panel. Thank you very much for your patience and waiting as we've slightly overrun on our first half. So this is our investigation looking at taxi and private hire industry, and following on the report we did a few years ago, which, as I said at the start, where we said that TfL were woefully inadequate in this area. We want to see what's improved, what hasn't, and what we can do to raise standards across the whole industry. So I'd like to welcome our guests today. So we've got Alan Miller, who is from the London Suburban Taxi Drivers Coalition. Welcome, Alan. Steve McNamara, thank you so much for coming in today. From the Licensed Taxi Drivers Association. I know you've rejigged your diary to make sure you could be here, so thank you for that. Trevor Merralls, who's from the United Cabbies Group. Welcome. And Mick Walker from the London Cab Drivers Club, LCDC as it's better known. Thank you so much for coming along today. And David's going to open our questions in this section. David.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all here. I just wonder if I can ask you a general question to start with. Is what do you think are the key challenges facing the licensed taxi trade in London? I guess we'll start with Steve. What do you think?
The key challenges facing the taxi trade in London is the primary legislation that deals with it was written in the 19th century. It doesn't deal with the problems and issues that we face in the 21st century. I was with the Transport Minister this morning. You've heard Steve Wright refer to the DFT working group report, which I'm sure you've all seen and have copies of. They're not revealing too much other than the fact that they will be bringing legislation forward in the Queen's speech next year. But I don't know, they wouldn't sort of detail as to what they're going to do. Our primary concerns with the legislation is that there's no definition applying for hire. We've argued from day one that was required. There's no definition of pre-booked. There's also a desperate need to tackle cross-border hiring. There's a desperate need to bring a cap on numbers. The previous mayor asked for a cap, the ability to cap numbers. The current mayor's asked for the ability to cap numbers. And it's absolute madness that authorities around the country are not able to do so. Hopefully, the words of wisdom in this report will find their way through into the legislation, and we can actually start to move forward, because without it I think we are going to continue to struggle.
Right, thanks. Trevor, have you got anything else to add to that?
Yeah, quite. Thank you for inviting me first from UCG. Yeah, the situation is it's coming to the stage now, and London has got to choose whether they want a taxi service or not. You've traditionally and historically had a two-tier system, and at the moment the two-tier system is not viable. When we have got the figures of private hire drivers that are out there now licensed, you in effect have got a ghost taxi fleet. Because whatever people might, and TfL's view is that it's got to be sorted out in court, it is applying for hire via an app. Display and availability, they're private hire driving around all around London acting like taxis, and it is impossible for a regulated industry like ourselves to survive, because we don't set our tariffs. That's set for us by TfL. We have been, quite rightly so, we're all green, we don't want to poison kids, we don't want to poison ourselves, but we've got a new £65,000 vehicle that we can't afford, whilst private hire have got an extension to, was it 2023, and they'll have a choice of 6, 7, 8, who knows how many vehicles. I saw with some interest yesterday that in January next year, Audi are launching their all-electric vehicle. Now at the moment our trade is reliant on one vehicle, and we, as I said before, we cannot compete when we have got a ghost taxi fleet out there. And the time has come now for you, the Assembly members, and for TfL to decide if you want a taxi, if you want a two-tier, the finest taxi service in the world that you inherited, you never created, you inherited it. It's now the time to start showing some teeth and putting back into its boxes what is a taxi driver and what is a private hire driver. What is a pre-booking? What is an EL?
Thanks. Thank you. Mick, have you got anything to
add to that? I'm in complete agreement with Steve and Trevor. I'd just like to add to that there are too many private hire drivers. Does London really need one taxi stroke private hire driver for every 50 residents? Is that viable? And the other thing is, we all sat, well, I didn't sit here, but you sat here 4 years ago. You knew what the problems were. You identified the problems. Unfortunately, even you weren't taking that much notice of. And you knew that our trade was in trouble. Well, since you produced Future Proof, our fleet of taxi drivers is reduced by 6%. We're a dying industry. And the main reason for that is regulation. It's not close enough. There's too big a gulf between our regulations and private hire regulations. As Trevor alluded, £63,000 for a new vehicle. Now, here's the thing. 4 years ago, we didn't have a vehicle, but we were told we've got to have this vehicle in 4 years. It was set. Private hire had a range of vehicles that were appropriate then. They've got another 2 years. They didn't even need the 2 years. They already had the vehicles available 4 years ago. We didn't. We were told 4 years ago to expect 5 vehicles. We have one. We have a monopoly that we have to deal with. That's why one of the reasons why I have to pay £63,000 for a new vehicle. And that vehicle in itself is going to cause horrendous problems for our tariff in the near future. The tariff has got to be completely revamped because of the disparity that's going to come in between running costs and capital costs. All our capital costs are going to be loaded into the first 5 years of a cab's life, while our current costs, that expenditure is going to be across 15 years. What do we do in that first 5 years?
The Mayor says that he's got some sort of money, a pot of money to help you with that. He says he'll give you grants of £5,000. Is that enough?
No, it's applied in the wrong way. It is not being taken up because the way it's being distributed, it's not worth bringing a cab off the road. There the cab is worth more on the road than it is to scrap it or to resell it to another cab driver. So I think I don't have the actual figures, but I know that it's not being taken up. There are lots of cabs coming off the road, but it's not because of that scheme.
As far as I understand.
And that's the other thing, the fleet itself is now reducing, because faced with that price, drivers are not buying it. There's more cabs coming off the road. We've never had so few new cabs coming onto the road as this year. And who can blame the driver? There are so many risks involved. A working man to risk 63,000 or 56,000 pounds worth of capital.
Well.
Sorry?
Could be a woman as well. We do have women taxi
yeah, of course.
drivers,
Yeah,
don't we?
okay. Beg your pardon. Yeah, there are a lot of women drivers. But to risk £56,000, and it is a risk. We don't know how this taxi is going to perform. We don't know what's going to be available 5 years from now. I was listening to Costing the Earth on Radio 4 the other night, and they're saying that in 5 years from now, the range of an electric vehicle could be 300 miles. The cost of the vehicle could be the same as a fossil-driven vehicle. Where does that leave a cab driver that pays £56,000? It's not really viable.
Okay. Thanks for your answer. I'll just, I'm aware of time, so I'll just move on to Alan. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the invitation. All the previous speakers have covered all the issue on there, but of course it's the primacy of the law. The taxi industry has been heavily regulated, as it should be, but all our competitors are not. We've been, you're talking about the future. If you look at certainly in the green badge levels, they've remained 20,000 for 23 years. I would ask, why is that the case? Why hasn't it increased? Because you've seen the dramatic increases in private hire. Then you've added Uber to it. So, as I'm a suburban driver, we're seeing the problems that now the All London drivers facing. They're a minority. And when you get past to the tipping scale, if they reduce any further, it's over. It's been done by stealth. As previous speakers have stated, you've got the issue, it's going to have 5 vehicles, we've got 1. How is it allowed to get to this position? How is it allowed to get position? On top of that, you've been denied road space for all other forms of transport, cycling, etc. And it's how that was laid out. From an objective point of view, and I'm talking about driving a cab, which I still do, when the cycle lanes were put in, I suggested it goes down the middle of cycle lane or above the height. Now, classically, since the deregulation bill of 2015, we've remained heavily regulated, as we should be. But if you take one classic road that we all use, the embankment, try going east from Northumberland Avenue. You can't do it, it's one lane. So and this is where the duty of care hasn't been put in by TfL. If you're coming down the embankment, before you get Lower Thames Street, ask yourself what happens when the emergency service are needed, the police or the ambulance. They have to use the bus lane. So there's no duty of care. If someone's in an accident in a one lane, it comes to a stop. And the only way their services can get, they drive down the bus lane, the cycle lane. It's ridiculous. So whoever thought that out, there was no thought. And of course, we're nipping all the junctions. And if the taxi can't move, the meter keeps rising. It's not like a pre-booked job where you've got a fixed fare. So the whole structure of the industry is being wiped out.
Right.
Now, when we say the numbers, I think I was watching the previous, Steve Wright quoted private hire numbers. That's not exactly what was taking place there, less. We'll take the cab industry. We're listing at suburban and green, I think 21,000. It's lower than it's been. It's falling down. It's going to continue to fall because the cost of the new vehicle, the older drivers are looking at the cost and thinking, we're not going to be able to do this. So that's forcing the issue. And the legislation that we've got, I was at a meeting with TfL a fortnight ago. I can give you the dates because I document everything I do. I asked them, on an issue of the rank issue, why don't you use the legislation? They said, well, we're loath to use it. I said, well, if you've got legislation, you don't use the primacy of the law, you've excluded it. And they've excluded it for us.
Okay. Well, thank you for all your answers. There seems to be a common theme there with regulation, the difference in the numbers between taxi and private hire industry. But TfL is your regulator. And I wonder if I can ask you now, what do you think of TfL's performance as your regulator? And also specifically, do you feel that they've engaged with you effectively in the taxi sector in the last couple of years since we've had the current mayor? But perhaps I'll start with you again, Steve. Again.
TfL's handling of the taxi trade has been abysmal, to put it lightly. Our biggest concern with the way that they've dealt with us is from day one, we've asked them to test the blind for hire argument. We've argued that if you're showing a vehicle on an app, as Trevor said, you're exhibiting it for hire, it must be for hire. We've submitted countless legal opinions, and they said, well, our opinion is it's not the case. And if you want to do something about it, you need to run a prosecution. We've entered into the prosecution. We've tried to run private prosecutions at different times. It's incredibly difficult for anybody to run a private prosecution because the first thing anyone looks at was, this is an important issue. Why are the police or a regulator not running it? Why are you running it? We've had to JR, the DVLA wouldn't give us details. We come up against a multi-million-pound defence, and we're unable to run a private prosecution. So as a result of that, applying for hire has never been defined in the courts as it should have been. As far as we're concerned, our biggest failing at TfL has been not to get a definition of applying for hire. Hopefully, as I said, the legislation next year will define it. That's been the biggest weakness of TfL. Many of the issues we argue could have been dealt with much quicker and much more efficiently than they've dealt with. They've been very slow to react situations. The whole Uber licensing thing was a disaster from day one. They didn't give it they didn't react quick enough. And when you see the paperwork that appeared before the licensing court, they'd had concerns for 2.5, 3 years previously, but they'd been sort of scared, stymied. I mean, you all, looking at me and you know what went on. They were frightened to take them on. And so if you ask me if they've let the cab trade down, yes, they have let us down. They've let us down badly.
Yeah. Alan, what do you think about TfL as a regulator?
Well, they didn't regulate. I mean, that's in a nutshell, they didn't regulate. They've done the opposite. Under the Johnson administration, it was a disaster for us. We didn't even get to the meetings. I think I won with James Cleverly. He did try to assist in his area, in Bexley. But on all the other issues, no. Remained silent. When I did get to meet Helen Chapman and Emerson, they sat there, didn't answer the questions. And because they don't take minutes, everything is documented. I spent most of my working life in the printing industry.
Right.
And we had stenographers at every meeting. You have to be accountable. So there's no accountability. We sat with them at the meeting, they said nothing, so we sent our minuted notes to them with me. Because if you remain silent, we've got no Fifth Amendment here, have we? Although people try and introduce it, they haven't regulated it. They deliberately haven't regulated. And again, as the earlier speaker at the private hire meeting, what they said is the corporate interest. That's what is taken over. We're a public vehicle. Whether people say we are or not, we're a public vehicle. If you're not, go and look in Hansard. Have a look all the way back. It wouldn't be taxi and private hire. If we were a private vehicle, we'd be private. And that's where it comes in with the ranks. Because the blockage, and I'll tell you this personally, because I've had to deal with a different framework as the three gentlemen to my left, because they're all London drivers. We've been blocked by TfL, and it comes to TfL, and I can name people, that's not what I'm here to do today, who have blocked us. And the only progress we've made is going to the councils. I've met 11. Is go to the AMs and going to the MPs. And we've had to come through that structure to get me here today.
Okay, thanks.
So that's about a regulatory process that doesn't work. There's vested interests, and that is still the case.
Right. Thanks for your answer. I'll ask the same question to you, Mick, and then to Trevor. What do you think of TfL as a regulator and their performance?
Well, we all feel let down by them. But one particular thing that I think is the communication with TfL. This came up again 4 years ago in Future Proof. You recommended that we had wider communication with them, more open communication. It's gone the reverse way. We used to have a quarterly meeting with the mayor. That's been stopped. That's been replaced by a quarterly meeting with Mike Brown. But Mike Brown treats the meetings as though they're optional. Sometimes he attends, sometimes he cancels. You ask for minutes to be taken. My organisation would like minutes to be taken. They're not. They point blank refuse. They say that action points are enough. We say they're not, because we go to meetings and then we go back again and they say something wasn't brought up at the previous meeting. All of this, it's not good. We should, any contact my organisation have had with this committee has been complimentary. We all know that without the public, we're nothing, we're gone. So we share the same interest. But our relationship with TfL is adversarial.
Okay.
It shouldn't be.
Right, yeah, indeed. So, well, I mean, taking minutes is something that could easily be rectified, indeed.
Indeed.
I'm aware of time again, hopefully. Trevor, have you got anything to
I'm going to
add?
have to be conscious of the time as well and keep my language polite for the esteemed guest here. But, so I'll tell you what I think of TfL. I think they're an absolute disgrace, because their role of a regulator is to regulate. They're to protect the public. That's and they're not doing that. Okay. Everyone's touched on about the minutes. Well, since the UCG were allowed to attend TfL meetings from January 2017, every meeting I've asked for minutes. I go to a taxi operational performance meetings every couple of months. Questions get asked there. They don't answer them. They say, we'll get back to you. And it's now been a year and we're still waiting for answers to certain questions. We point out that things were said, i.e., there's a certain a private hire app that everyone seems to be a little bit obsessed with. Actually, TfL admitted in one of these TOPS meetings that they never ever saw where the booking goes to. It was never demonstrated to them. But you try getting that in the minutes. When we kept pointing out that you said this, nothing. I think it's absolutely shocking. I think my esteemed colleague from the Suburban was quite right. Taxis are privately owned, publicly hired. And that is in Anside. And when we decided to have a two-tier system and the private hire legislation came in 1998, if you look at Anside, it goes to great lengths in both the Commons and the House of Lords to determine and say that once these are licensed, they should not be entering the private hire market. That is solely the domain of the Hackney Carriage. Now, I've had many meetings with TfL, alongside like everyone else along here has, and I've said that TfL have the powers, which they have. It's called secondary legislation. And if people don't like it, they can take it to court. I.e., we believe most firmly that these apps are applying for hire. All TfL will do as a regulator is turn and say, take it out of our hands, put it before a judge and say, is this applying? And if the private hire industry don't like it, they can take it to court and challenge it. That's what the role of the regulator is. But the regulator says to me, I know the UCG's views on this. If you don't like it, take us to court. Well, I don't like it. My trade don't like it. And we can't sustain this. And, I am conscious of the time. But if you thought TfL was wonderful, we wouldn't even be having this meeting here today. TfL is a bureaucracy. It's uncontrollable. It wants to be all things to all men, and it can't be that. The regulator sometimes has to do what is... The public wants certain things, but you have to protect the public from themselves. And that's what the regulator's role is. And TfL seem to have forgotten that. But they're very heavy the taxi industry is very heavily regulated, and I'm not objecting to that, because you're driving people around, vulnerable people. You should be. You should be regulated. But by the same rule, if you're going to licence private hire, there has to be regulations in there. There has to be ground rules. And what, you know, many years ago, some of you might not remember this, but some people within the taxi trade said things like increase private hire drivers, minicab drivers, topographical knowledge. Now, your esteemed guests before us, their answer to that was, why do we need to have an increased topographical knowledge, our drivers, when all our bookings are pre-booked, we can set the route, and it doesn't matter if it takes 15 minutes or 25 minutes or 3/4 of an hour, because you've got a fixed price. Well, that's not happening now, is it? Because you allow a company that can surge the public. I mean, let's be honest, if I wanted to go and buy a pint of milk now at Tesco's on a Tuesday morning, and they want to charge me £1, but if it's busy on a Saturday, they want to charge me £2.36, well, everyone would be putting them out of business. But the regulator says, oh, that's perfectly great. Well, the regulator is there to regulate. And, you know, I've said my piece, I'm conscious of the time, but I think they're an absolute disgrace.
Thank you. I've just got one final question on this. We'll keep your answers brief if you could. I mean, Uber is a big player now, and the whole taxi and private hire sector. It's the biggest private hire operator. You know, they've got a short licence which is going to expire at the end of next year. What do you think that TfL should do when Uber's current licence expires next year? I'll start with you, Mick.
For a start, they should end the on-screen location of vehicles, because that's playing for hire. The on-screen is the same as the hand in the air. Okay. And they're instant bookings. They call themselves ride-hailing.
Right.
It's not a pre-booked service.
Yeah.
So they should really come under.
So have a phone call.
Regulation nearer to us.
Right.
I mean, for a start, they're discriminatory against the disabled. We're 100% wheelchair accessible. And that's absolutely correct. But they're the same. They've got 40,000 vehicles. 50 of them are wheelchair accessible. That's discriminatory. And there's no financial reason for this, because their favoured choice of car is a Prius. Okay, we know it's good for the environment, but it's a £24,000 vehicle. They can access a wheelchair accessible MPV for just under £19,000. Money is not the reason they don't supply wheelchair accessible vehicles. It's their choice, and because they're allowed to make the choice. And they shouldn't be. Someone in a wheelchair should have the same access as somebody that's not. Now, that's the case with taxis. It's still not the case with private hire. This committee said 25% for normal private hire, if you like. It's still less than 1%. It's 530 vehicles across 90,000 vehicles.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's definitely something that needs to improve. I'll just throw it open to the rest of you. I mean, has anyone else got any thoughts about what TfL should do when Uber's current licence comes to an end?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was no coincidence that nowhere on their reasons for not re-licensing them was prime fire mentioned. Because TfL are in a situation, then they're going to have to explain to 110,000 private hire drivers, sorry for allowing you to come into an industry. That's not, sorry about that, but we've made a big mistake. But it's not just Uber, is it? Because you've now got a system called Calldeck, which is an app. And the apps, that's what all private hire are using. And these apps are duplicating human behaviour. That's exactly what they're doing. And so for the two-tier system to be maintained, you've got to have demarcations. And as I say, TfL are aware of this. Prior to the Uber deciding not to re-license Uber, they had the Mott MacDonald report. And Mott MacDonald turned and said that if you take the display of the vehicles off the screen, it will have a major impact on their business model. But if you leave it on the screen, the impact it will have on the taxi trade is immeasurable, which is liable to be settled in court. TfL were aware of this, but they still didn't do anything about it. So it's liable to be settled in court. And, that's the crux. TfL know, and they failed. And it's, as I keep repeating myself, you cannot have a two-tier system when we're all working the same ways. These apps, what private hire have got, are identical to the apps that taxis have got. Now, if we're all working in the exact same fashion, how have you got a two-tier system? Human behaviour is duplicating, technology is duplicating human behaviour, that's a fact, and TfL should be arguing along the lines of this is plying for hire, and not just Uber, bring them all into line. Bring them all into line. That way, the two-tier system will be viable. Okay. Carry on what we're doing now, and we are the last generation of taxi drivers.
All right, thanks. Just quickly, if you've got any other thoughts, Steve and Alan, just
very quick. Most salient point, we had taxi and private hire. Yeah. How did another group come in that can ignore all the legislation? The primacy of the law wasn't used. Don't forget, how many months ago you got the Prime Minister at Davos talking about Uber? What about talking about their own land-based companies here? She's talking about corporate, and that's what it's about. It's about corporate. Okay. They're either taxi or the private hire. They shouldn't have been legislated. And if we'd have broke one iota of them, we'll have all have lost our licence. But it carries on. That's without all the other add-ons they've given us, road crashes, you know, etc., sexual assaults. We wouldn't be here.
That comes back to Steve's original point about the legislation is out of date and needs to be updated. Final thoughts from you, Steve, on my questions. Anything to add?
Uber's licence, the licensing appeal was basically a farce. I mean, TfL went there, they refused them a licence and then turned up at the licensing appeal and took a neutral stance. I didn't really quite understand that, and an army of lawyers haven't been able to explain it to me either. It could just be that I'm not that bright, or that it wasn't a particularly sensible approach. You know, they refused a licence, turned up at court and said, we're not that bothered. How does that work? The big issue that you're getting loud and clear from all across the table, and TfL could have done it any time they wanted. They just simply say, as part of the licensing regulations that apply to everybody, is we won't let you show an available vehicle on an app. We won't let you know, if you're going to be licensed by us, you can't show an available vehicle. End of. And if somebody then wants to challenge that, as no doubt they would do, then that would be the way to do it. But instead, Transport for London took the stance that, well, we won't do anything, and we'll just let people do what they want. And that's where they went wrong. They went wrong with the same way in the licensing appeal. There's all sorts of options going on now with the licensing appeal, as you're probably aware. And it might not actually come, the licence might not actually last 18 months, but we'll see.
Great. Thanks for your answers, everyone. Thank you,
Great,
Chair.
thank you. Let's move on to look at the Mayor's action plan. Florence.
Thank you. Good afternoon, gentlemen. The Mayor's action plan in 2016 outlined a number of measures which would help the taxi trade. So you'll remember that some of them include additional access to 20-mile-per-hour bus lanes by the end of this 2016. Asking London boroughs to let you access some of their bus lanes and roads they control. By the end of summer, looking at increasing your technology so that taxi information could be on TfL journey planners. Obviously, all taxis now have to accept contactless and card payments, and giving drivers access to facilities in train stations, toilet facilities and other things. Do you feel that the Mayor's delivered on those 2016 pledges and the action plan?
I'll go first. They're very fine and laudable objectives, but the best example being that the Mayor's plan that we should have universal access where buses are allowed. Just recently, the City of London have introduced a bus-only access scheme at Bank Junction. And Transport for London have supported the city in that exclusion. The Camden is shortly looking to exclude us from Tottenham Court Road. Incidentally, they're looking to exclude us on the grounds of pollution and accident stats. The accident stats at the time were comprised of taxi and private hire, and our accident stats hadn't gone up. They were based on flawed stats. We're being excluded on pollution grounds. You've already heard that we now have to have the only zero emission capable vehicle. All new cabs have to be zero emission capable. So what we're saying now is that you can't say one thing and then do another. Shortly towards the end of the year, the City of London will be doing a fresh consultation on Bank called All Change at Bank, and I would certainly ask everybody in this room, and certainly we'd be asking Transport for London to support taxi access into Bank Junction. It's got to the stage where the biggest issue as far as the taxi trade is concerned is not necessarily our competitors, it's the fact that we can't move around. Every single report you'll have seen here at the Transport Committee, you'll be aware of traffic speeds in London, you'll be aware of what's happening. We can't get anywhere. Excluding us from more and more schemes, Tottenham Court Road, perhaps Oxford Street and Bank Junction, is not the way to keep this city moving. It's a crazy, crazy scheme. Any of these schemes, the Mayor should be actively campaigning for us to be included, not writing. Mike Brown wrote to Mike Brown wrote to the city and actually supported our exclusion. Not what the Mayor's action plan says, totally contrary to that. We need to be included in all schemes.
Trevor?
Yeah, I mean, to touch on what Steve's just said, and it's laudable what the Mayor's proposals were, but what you propose is, on your manifesto is sometimes not as easy to do in reality when you get elected, because you're coming up against individual boroughs. But I think that with the best intentions, he was trying to, what he perceived to be help the London taxi trade. But of course, for whatever reason, it's not happened, whether it be for political reasons, because you might have, or whether it just be for a number of reasons. But Steve touched on the bank, which is a problem. It's a very emotive issue, because TfL argued in the European Court of Law against Addison Lee that London taxis are part of the London transport infrastructure. So I find it quite sad, really, that they write to the bank supporting our exclusion. If you were cynical or paranoid, you would think that this is bus operators looking out for their own interests, but that would be paranoia, wouldn't it? But if you look at the real statistics, Steve touched on that, we wasn't part of the problem. The problem you've got, and the problem the city had, and I think, we're going to probably touch on this. I am conscious of the time, but, I'm not anti-cyclist. Of course, you wouldn't be. But what you've got is that the majority of the vehicles on London roads are not private vehicles. They're either commercial vehicles, deliveries, trucks for doing building sites, private hire, taxis, buses. Now, what they've done there is they tried to reduce the traffic, but all you've done is move the traffic round the corner. And you really are excluding us, and it's like a restriction of trade in a certain way. And you're discriminating against the people, the vulnerable people, who maybe whose mobility is not as good as yours or mine. And you have to say to them, well, you're going to put you out in your wheelchair now, and you're going to have to wheel yourself down the road, down to there, and it's raining, and good luck. It's just not acceptable, because we are part of the public transport infrastructure.
Mick?
Yes, as the previous speakers have just said, they're laudable things, but if they're not followed through, and we always go back to the same, it's the people who are running TfL, where I deal with, remain silent, come back next week, come back a month. I mean, I delivered one 4 years ago, we're back here today. People change, but the problems, 6 years, 8 years, and of course, you need regulation. I'm sorry, you deregulate the whole system in London, and you regulate us. I mean, you're telling us that we're the most polluting vehicle. It can't be. It's buses, private hire by the sheer numbers alone. And of course, if you're not moving in traffic, the roads are being denied to us. It's just come back and sit in a cab for an hour. You'd see it yourselves. And this is the great problem. What I try to do at meetings, I photograph it, do everything. That's what we're talking about. And we come back, we know what's gone wrong. They are fixable. And of course, in the wider context, we've got no police, you can't get instant access. You can't, if there's a problem, go and see it on the roads, come in on the roads, come in a taxi, sit in there, and you'll see it yourself. It doesn't need volumes of notes, report back. We know what the problems are, and we actually all know what's causing it. And the denying of access, I see it coming more. Camden, we know. Jules Pipe, who was the Mayor of Hackney before he moved into TfL, they've closed Stoke Newington, you can't get through. One road possibly, but the people who live in the one road are going mad. He said everyone's coming down my road. So we know what we're creating, but we need transparency and say that's the plan. And
so if we move away from the example of Bank Junction and Tottenham Court Road, in terms of the action plan, do you feel that there's anything that's had a positive impact in terms of the trade to try and help? So, for example, do you feel that a number of people now do use cards and some people don't carry cash. So yes, there were cost implications to you installing that, but do you feel that that's had a positive impact? Just that as an example.
Sorry?
If we move away from the bank junction example, from the action plan, do you feel that there's any of that which has been implemented? Okay, mindful that not everything has. Are there any things that has had a positive impact on the trade?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's certain aspects. Yeah, people do cards. A lot of people were opposed to it, but you've got to move into the modern age and what people use. But certainly from my own with the action plan, I spend all my time going through the AMs and councils to get it implemented, because when I go to TfL, they say, we'll get back to you. And this is where the problem lies. It's not what the mayor's saying, it's the implementation of it.
Yeah.
And they're all laudable things.
We've definitely taken that on. I think we'll feed
and of
that
course,
back.
we understand the change of the mayor. We're 2 years in, but they need to be put in ASAP because of the drag, not only in his administration, what's gone on before.
Yeah.
We're talking about a long decline, a long steeping decline, and it has to be addressed. His action plans, you need time. I mean, you haven't got an endless time, have you? What, 10 years? Businesses haven't, they go out of business.
Yeah.
We need this situation to be dealt with. Who is the overseer of whether they're implemented? His action plan comes up. Who actually says, well, you haven't implemented this?
That's part of our job as scrutineers.
No, but what I'm trying to say, you relate it to the mayor, you're the AMs, you relate it to the mayor, that it's being blocked internally here in this...
Thank you, Ellen. I'm very conscious of time, so thank you. You've made your point there. Thank you for that, Florence. Can I just welcome more students from Forest Hill School from Lewisham? Welcome along. We're the Transport Committee. We're looking at the future of taxi and private hire services today in London. How can we raise the standards for passengers? Keith wanted to just quickly come in on there.
Just a quick one, really.
To one of the panel.
In his manifesto, the Mayor said that he would give taxi drivers special privileges. I just wondered if you're aware of any special or if you could tell me of any extra special privileges that you've been afforded during his mayoralty.
Maybe just to Steve, as we're
Steve,
tight
yeah,
for
if you
time.
could just do that.
I'm struggling with that one. Some of the mayor's stuff has been useful. They've given us access to a few bus lanes we never had before. The one over the Euston underpass, but you know, it's a handful. Others we've asked for have always been a problem. It's always down to the boroughs. It's not TfL. They've got a right to this one and right to that one, and then here we are 2 years later, still waiting. It's special privileges. I understand. I've never tried it myself, but you can use the toilet, the underground toilet at Oxford Circus, apparently, if you show your badge. Not that there's anywhere near Oxford Circus to park, but if there was, you could use the loo.
And just quickly on disabled access, all your cabs are fitted to take wheelchairs. And, you touched on it, Trevor. Is this going to be a problem then? Because there's no, and I don't want to bring up Bank again, but Bank Station isn't step free. So if you wanted to get to near Bank Station without a cab going there, you wouldn't be able to get there, would you? Because the buses don't stop at Bank anyway; they drive right past it.
Well, that's the sad indictment of 21st century London, isn't it? Because I thought we come away from sort of prejudices like that. It's basically that's the fact. Yeah, if you're in a wheelchair, good luck.
So do you think that cabs should be afforded a special privilege of, when they're carrying a disabled passenger, greater access to areas that they can't access at the moment?
Well, obviously I would say that we should all carte blanche, but at least have a caveat of something like that. Because, I mean, but I would say, once again, the special privilege is the fact that we are privately owned, publicly hired. So, and I think we should have access to everywhere like that, you know. And it's not, you know, the bank seems to be the one that's in, but it's going to be more and more prevalent, isn't it? If you know, I don't want to touch, you know, I'm conscious of the time, but Tottenham Court Road, at the top of Tottenham Court Road, there's a big hospital. You know, what are we saying to people? What are we saying to people now in wheelchairs who have to get to the hospital? Well, we'll drop you off at basically the top end, the bottom end of Oxford Street, and you can wheel yourself up there.
Yeah.
Or we drop you near Euston Road, and you can wheel yourself down there. It's just not.
That's a really important issue. It really is. Yeah.
TfL's defence of that one is they say, oh, it's not us, it's Camden, but Tottenham Court Road is being funded by TfL. It's quite clear. If they're not allowed, if any of these schemes are not compatible with the mayor's transport strategy, then they shouldn't fund it. End of.
Exactly. Right, let's move on. I am conscious of time, so if I could ask you, gentlemen, just to try and keep really important points, try and keep them brief. Congestion. Keith, you're going to lead on this.
Yeah, thank you. It's almost a silly question, really. To what extent are taxi drivers affected by traffic congestion, and should the Mayor address this problem? Steve, you want to...
I'll go. You want to go before, or do you want me to have a go at that?
Should the Mayor?
Well,
sorry, I should have said how should the Mayor address this problem.
Well, obviously the traffic has a big impact, and I have sort of briefly touched, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll be brief. We've touched on it. You know, whilst I'm not anti-cycling, I think there should be people to be allowed to cycle in London. They should be allowed to do it safely. It's been ill thought out. So what you've actually got is all you've done is move the traffic into the adjacent roads, and it just gridlocked. And of course, we work on a tariff. You know, we work on a meter. So it's basically making us unviable and unaffordable. Whereas our competitors, if strictly under the Private Hire Reg 1998 Act, are supposed to give a fixed fare and a stated fare, but they don't do that, obviously.
And it's Could I just say, as you maybe know, our fares work on a combination of time and distance.
Yes.
Our night rate is supposedly 40% above our day rate. The reality is, because of traffic, it's less than 15%.
Really?
Yeah, that's how much difference the traffic makes to our fares. And it's the public that suffer, not us.
Sure.
The three primary causes of traffic congestion in London, as acknowledged by your report a few years ago, is the sheer number of private hire vehicles, the increase in white van deliveries, and the installation of the cycling infrastructure. Now, whilst the cycling infrastructure, we want segregated cycling, believe it or not, it absolutely suits us that cyclists are separated from us, it's safer for us, it's easier. Some of these schemes that have been implemented don't work. Some do, many do, but some don't. They certainly need looking at. We've advocated for some time that the vast majority of cycling infrastructure should be on a rush hour basis only, should be installed in the morning, rush hour in the morning, rush hour in the evening. You know, why is the traffic grid locked at 3 o'clock in the morning when there's nobody on a bike? Whereas in the morning there's more people on bikes, as Caroline says, and they're overused. We should have more of them, and they should, you know, there's pop-up solutions, there's all sorts of solutions. That's the cycling infrastructure. The white vans, what you're going to do with white van deliveries, I don't know. The number of private hire vehicles, you know, if I can be as bold, you made a mistake in not supporting the Mayor's proposals to have private hire vehicles pay the congestion charge. It's dead easy. The number of private hire vehicles are controlled. That's the operator controls the vehicles. So the scare stories that you were told by Steve Wright and the boys about paying the congestion charge, we're going to be having 100 cars all paying the congestion charge every day, absolute dross. What happens is I'm a private hire operator, I control my drivers. I've got 50 drivers, and this morning I have 3 jobs going into the congestion charge zone. These 3 take the 3 jobs in. I then flag them on my system. Any jobs I've got during the day inside the zone, these 3 do. I don't send you lot into the congestion charge zone. It's dead easy. For local minicab firms that control their drivers properly, as they're meant to do, it's absolutely dead easy. Wouldn't have been as easy for the ACT firms, but that would have been their problem. The reality is that you made a mistake. Private vehicles paying the congestion charge would have had a massive impact and would have reduced congestion.
Yeah, I'm going to second that, because that's a subject I forgot to touch on. That is, second what Steve just said there. It was a missed opportunity.
Right, that's helpful. What has been the impact of the private hire parking facility at Heathrow? I think you guys can.
Well,
Trevor?
My rep at Heathrow, he's telling me that the private hire parking bank at Heathrow can have 800 vehicles in it. And ours has got 430. So the drivers at Heathrow are asking, why can't we have that AVA and move the private hire to another? That's what they're telling me. And he also goes on to tell me that since the police's budget's been cut down there's no TAT squad down there. So, you know, I'm not an expert at Heathrow because I don't work at Heathrow, but I can only go by the 2 things that he raised with me.
Right. Steve, you got any comments? You have any feedback?
I mean, the whole setup at Heathrow is backside facing. Private hire vehicles are meant to be pre-booked. What we're seeing at Heathrow at the moment is predominantly on the app firms. They're still loitering in suburban streets, and they choose not to use the park, their advanced booking park at certain times of the day, when they know by not being in it they can bring about a surge or an increase in prices, and then they'll drive on to the airport that way. The current way it works is you should have to go through the park even if there's nobody in the park. So in other words, the park's empty. As an example, the taxi rank, even if I drive out the airport now and there's not a cab out there and there's 500 people on all the terminals, I still have to go through the system. That doesn't work with the private hire industry. They go straight to the terminals. That should certainly be changed.
Right, and who governs that? Is that TfL or is that Heathrow?
No, that's BAA.
BA? Yeah, okay. And just a quick one, road pricing. Do you feel that... Oh, sorry, that's... Sorry.
No.
David wanted to ask it.
No, I've got Sean and David down on my list.
Yeah.
Are you not doing that one?
No, I'm not going to do that, no. So
David, you're doing it, are you
road
okay?
pricing. The other thing I was going to ask has been covered. Yeah, I mean, some people are talking about replacing the congestion charge and the T-zone and the ULEZ and vehicle duty and vehicle tax as well with one all-in road pricing system. I mean, it's not by any means everyone agrees with that, but I wonder what your thoughts are on road pricing as a replacement and as a solution to congestion. Steve, yeah.
Smart road pricing has to be the way forward. Unfortunately, the current infrastructure, as we know, is a load of old-fashioned cameras on poles. And the reason that the private hire trade are actually exempt is they're not exempt. They're only supposed to be exempt when they're what we call POB. They've got a passenger on board. But the technology doesn't allow for that. The technology just lets you read a number plate. And so, therefore, there's a blanket exemption applies. Smart road pricing would be the way forward. As you're aware, already the all new cabs are going to be ZEC. We're all 100% wheelchair accessible. We're also compellable, and by compellable that means that I have to take you where you want to go. So if you stop me in Park Lane, I have to take you into Piccadilly inside the current congestion charging zone, or if I'm on the edge of the T charging zone, I have to take you within it. So therefore any sort of road pricing would have to be incorporated, and a licence fee would have to be exempt. However, road pricing, smart pricing across the 24-hour period has got to be the way going forward. Some of the congestion at night in the West End and the city is worse than it is during the day. Certainly needs looking at. Smart road pricing has got to be the way forward, got to.
Would the others of you agree, or have any of you got the
nothing
opposite?
to add, but I'd agree.
On that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if you put in road pricing, it would be to exclude. That's the primary thing for road pricing. Because you levy charge, you've got congestion charge, it would be a step further. What limit would you set? I mean, currently, the taxi trade can't afford to survive as it's in its state, with what's stacked against them. We've got so many add-ons coming in. So I would need detailed the proposal in full, not like the ad hoc way we've gone about the situation with the roads where we are now, talking about Bank Junction, cycle lanes, how it's laid out. You need a foolproof system because you're changing dramatically as you've changed the roads. We're congested, we can't move. All those things are loaded. Road pricing, you need a long debate on this one, a serious debate. It doesn't have to take years, but can't say we'll put in road pricing. What do we set it? Keep raising it, you'll lose more people. But is it really solving the issue? I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Sean wants to come in.
Almost goes on from Alan's point, really. Has anybody ever done any modelling on the impact it would have on new road pricing? Because we've talked about road pricing today. I keep hearing it, but I'm with Alan. I don't think there's enough evidence to suggest how it would be done. Would you want a different rate to what me as a private car owner would want? Has anybody attempted to answer these questions in any way?
No, I mean, road pricing, we would have to be exempt as we are from the congestion charge for the simple reason that we're compellable. If I'm made to go somewhere, how can I be made to pay a charge to go there? Just the same as the buses would be exempt, we are public transport, we would be exempt.
Okay, I understand. So you're saying you're in favour of road pricing as long as
as a method
exempt?
As a method of addressing congestion and unnecessary congestion, yes, certainly. What it would do, it would incentivise the white van deliveries to amalgamate their deliveries to, rather than have one van delivering one parcel, 50 vans, they would bring them into one van. it would certainly utilise existing resource to a much greater degree and thus free up road space.
I hear the pros and the cons, but just to be clear, you're saying you're in favour of road pricing as long as you're exempt, and also to answer this question at this point, nobody has looked at the impact it would have on you, but if you're exempt then it'd be none.
Well, the impact on us would be that we might be able to move it around a little bit better than we can at the moment. As I explained to you earlier, the biggest problem facing the cab trade at the moment isn't necessarily a competition, or it's the sheer fact that we cannot move around. I mean, if you speak to cab drivers, the biggest issue we have is people getting out of cabs because they can't get somewhere. It's not actually getting them in the cab, it's actually getting them where they want to go.
Yeah. And to touch on what Steve said, he said we're compellable, because it gets back to we've got to take a fare. We can't refuse a journey based on within a radius, because it gets back to what I said earlier. We're part of the public transport infrastructure. We're privately owned, publicly hired, exactly the same as buses. And unless the law's changed, or we end up going a bit sooner, it seems to be TfL's ultimate aim, we end up with the one tier, then we won't be exempt because we won't no longer exist. But all the time that we've got Hackney Carriage, and our Hackney Carriage, we've got a great tradition. Our trade is 360 years old. And and we should be quite proud of that. It's the last livery trade left, and it's aspirational for working men and women to actually pull themselves up, and it's aspirational. And under TfL's watch and the GLA and all the 3-4 mayors we've had, it's the demise of we're looking at the demise of the great London taxi trade, and that is damning on TfL.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to looking at supporting people to become taxi drivers. Navin.
Thank you, Chair. To what extent does TfL need to support more people to become taxi drivers, and how can they do that?
The numbers on the knowledge of London are down. There's various reasons as to why they're down. Transport for London, there's certainly some minor bits on the knowledge that could be changed. That doesn't mean we need to reduce any standards. We certainly don't. There's an argument for making it more modular. The problem with taking the knowledge is you start off at the beginning of a very long road and you've got no idea where you are on the road as you're doing it until you reach the final stages. Making it more modular would be one aspect. They can certainly, they're looking at the moment of getting it recognised as a qualification, in order that possibly knowledge students could get funding as they can for many other, you get a government loan to do a university degree or something. They're looking at doing that. I think that would be a good incentive. I think we need to advertise it and make younger people more aware of it. The difference with many qualifications, including virtually all the trades, is you spend a number of time getting a qualification. Doesn't mean you're going to get a job. The one thing about becoming a taxi driver is you do the knowledge, and on a Friday morning they give you your badge, and you can go to work Friday afternoon and you're guaranteed a job. So I think they can help us to publicise it a bit more. I think they can get it rated as a qualification. I think that would help, and modularisation I think is certainly a way to go on it.
Why would you do the knowledge? As it stands at this present time, why would you do the knowledge? Why would you put yourselves through 3 to 4, 5 years of studying and the financial hardship and the mental strain, when after 6 weeks you can apply, pay your licence fee, and you get exactly the same job via an app? So when I've had this discussion with TfL, because the knowledge and applying for hire are intrinsically linked. If you look at my licence, or his licence, or his licence, and then your licence, it will say licence to apply for hire. It's no coincidence that knowledge numbers are now at the lowest ebb, because people don't have to go through the knowledge to be like a ghost taxi driver. It's no coincidence. And all the time you don't do it, the GLA or TfL do not do anything to maintain the two-tier system, then the knowledge, people will not go on the knowledge. It's human nature. Why would you, if you was a young person now, would you go and put 3 to 4 years of your life doing the knowledge, or will you send a £300 cheque into TfL and know you can do it in 6 weeks? That's the reality.
Do you want to come?
Yeah, if I can add to that. The knowledge is in serious trouble. The numbers of new candidates over the last 12 months is less than we've had in single months a decade or so ago. The largest knowledge school closed in the last 12 months. 2 of the other large ones have had to amalgamate. But to look at the knowledge is only to look at the symptoms. The problem, as Trevor says, is this playing for hire. If I can get a private hire licence and go ride-hailing, as the apps call their services, why would I do the knowledge? It doesn't make sense. 3 years on the knowledge. Well, even if, say, a taxi driver can earn 20% more than a driver on an app, a minicab driver, private hire driver on an app, it would still take him 12 years to get parity on earnings with that driver after 3 years. He loses the first 3 years. It takes him the next 9 to get parity. Why do it? There may not be a taxi service in 12 years. So why do knowledge? There's absolutely no economic justification any longer for signing up to the knowledge. If it was my own son and he asked me what should I do, ride-hailing or sign up for the knowledge, I'd say go ride-hailing. Seriously, that's what I'd say to him, because there is no economic gain.
Steve's mentioned about recognised qualification route. He's mentioned this sort of situation with knowledge. Obviously, what the Mayor and TfL have suggested to boost applications, in addition, is possibility of study loans, something which obviously I'd like to hear about. TfL has published a guidance brochure, which I understand they are circulating or intending to circulate widely to various careers kind of events and stuff like that. But I hear what you say. Question is, if you're not happy with the current provision or the efforts made by the Mayor or through TfL, what you reckon what do you reckon is required to boost the driver numbers, which are static, to say the least?
What's required straight away is parity. All taxi drivers, or potential taxi drivers and private hire drivers, should start from the same base. If I want to sign on as a taxi driver, I have to pay £500. I think it's in excess of £500, isn't it? I pay nothing if I want to become a private hire driver. There's a barrier straight away, £500. Why shouldn't we all start from the same base and the taxi driver progresses further than the private hire driver? The Mayor says he wants vocational training. Well, it isn't making a private hire driver do at least some of what a taxi driver does, vocational training, and give him the opportunity to move on further.
Well, I hear what Mick's saying, but I'm coming from a different angle, and my organisation, the UCG, are coming from a different angle. If you want to get numbers on the knowledge, it's very simple. It's very simple. You go before a judge and say these questions that you know what the probable answer is. That's why you've never gone there, TfL. You ask, is this flying for hire? If the judge says it's flying for hire, then everything goes back in its natural box. It upsets a few big businesses, I understand that, and it might affect. And then young men and women will go, because they would then sacrifice the time, the effort to get their trade, because they know they've got something sustainable and viable at the end of it. What we're offering them at the moment is we can give them MVQs, you give them what you like, but you can't promise them at the end of doing your 3 to 4 year knowledge that there's a job for you to come out to. And it gets back to the way we're going. It's not an exaggeration. We are heading towards one tier. And under your watch, everyone's watch, it's going to be the end of the iconic London taxi industry. And what everyone would say afterwards, we never ever wanted, our policies was never meant to get rid of the London taxi trade. That was never our ambition, that was never our intention, but that's what's going to happen. So you can put any incentives you want, you can give as many grants, you can go to the schools, because the kids have got to stay on to 18 now, and people like myself who weren't academic would be forced to stay on. This was a way out. But you can't ask people to do 3 to 4 years for nothing, when there's nothing at the end of it, because you can be a minicab driver in 6 weeks' time and do exactly the same job.
So the message is, unless there's level playing field, this is not going to work.
But you say a level playing field, that's assuming that we do the same job. And we don't do the same job. I'm a taxi driver, so I'm privately owned, publicly hired, privately owned, privately hired. And there's the difference. It's not the same job. Go back to what was 1998 when you first licensed them. You've reneged on that. Reneged on that because it went to great lengths in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And TfL have reneged on their when they were relicensing it. They won't enter the immediate hiring market. They won't be applying for hire. Well, what do you think they're doing right at this very... And not just one particular app, it's all of them. From you can name every single private hire, all using this call deck, they're all in the immediate hire. Do the maths. We cannot compete. Cannot compete.
Helen.
Yes, I think that's the last part, the most important part, when the gentleman just raised the issue of cost. Do an audit over a period of time, 4 years, 5 years, private hire, audit, do the taxi. It's not sustainable. Why would you put yourself through that? There's other better options. And because this has been done by stealth, it's the costs are rising in the cab, the costs are rising dramatically, the road space is being denied. I never see anyone out on doing the bikes, doing the knowledge. Might see one, and I travel extensively. You don't see it. And it's not a model to do. What would you say? Go and do that? Spend 3 or 4 or 5 years or whatever? You're not going to do it because we're being squeezed out by the apps, a whole host of things. And it's all there. It's just a mathematical equation. It's down to cost. We want to lower the cost. With privatisation of everything, from toilets to libraries, everything is being sold off. That is what we're doing, and I think obviously the aim to me is that we want to eradicate anything that's in the public realm.
Okay.
Trevor said.
Okay, I think we need to move on.
If I could just make one point.
Yeah.
The taxi service has always done advanced bookings through their radio circuits. It took a decade to destroy the radio circuits. They're gone. It just took 1 decade. The Mayor's action plan, if that was wholly implemented, that would solve all our problems. There's stuff that some of it's come to fruition, but it's coming too slowly. We don't have 10 years.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Is that okay now, Ben? Yeah. Right, I've got a number of members wanting to come in on this. The order I've seen them: Caroline, Joanne, Susan.
Thank you. Just very quickly, obviously the technology of app hailing is... there are massive issues in relation to the way that you're hailed from the street. And I get that, but I'm just wondering, just in terms of the knowledge, given that there's been that technological change in terms of how hiring goes on, is there something else that the knowledge can give that makes taxis special or different or deliver more for Londoners? And is that to do with safety? Is that to do with being better drivers? Is that to do with knowing and understanding our city and the nature of what our city is like, the different areas in our city? Is there a way that doing the knowledge can actually make people, that make Londoners understand what the benefit of that is? And I suppose I'm not necessarily asking you to come up with answers to that now, but I'm just thinking that there is something extraordinary about if you ever do get in a black cab with someone who just knows everything about London's streets. There's also, can that feed back to Transport for London? Are taxi drivers being used to give that knowledge about how the streets are working back? And I just wonder if there's doing the knowledge and becoming a taxi driver, if there isn't more that could be made out of the knowledge rather than it just allowing you to drive a taxi.
And Joanne's question is linked to that, you said, isn't it?
Do you want to? Having had a black cab driver in the family, I mean, I'm aware of the length of time and the difficulty going through your weeks and the weeks reducing as to when you get back for your next test. But given that even black cab drivers now have GPS in their cab, is there also a reason for suggesting that the knowledge could perhaps be shortened slightly, so it's not the 3, 4, 5 years, it's slightly shorter, but it still gives that two-tier and that very distinct difference between the private hire vehicles?
There's a few bits and pieces that could be done to not lower the standards, but perhaps alter the testing process very minorly that would reduce some of the. I'll give you the best example. Is when you've actually completed the knowledge of London and they're giving you a thing saying you then have to do what they call a suburbs test, and what that means is you just have to know roughly where the suburbs are. So if someone jumps in a cab and wants to go to Sidcup, you know where it is, you know where Enfield is. It's a very basic test. Well, when I did it, God was the boy. They used to tell you to come back the following week and you'd have a list of 20 runs. Now somehow that's evolved into a knowledge of its own. It's become, I think, over 100 runs, and you have to go back in 6 weeks and you have to get out and learn them, all totally and utterly unnecessary. Because if you get in my cab at 2 o'clock in the morning and want to go to Sidcup, I know it's down the A20, and I say to you halfway down, where do you want me to go next? I don't need to know that Sidcup High Street becomes Sidcup Road, becomes Sidcup High Street. I don't need to know that. So that's one method that it could be shortened. There's lots of little things like that could knock the time off.
I'll just pick up on what you said, and you're quite right that there is taxi drivers got the facility to use a GPS, but the difference is we're not totally reliant on them.
Yeah.
And there is a big difference. And if you was talking about reducing the standard to make it a quicker knowledge, then actually you're lowering it. You'll be having this debate in 10 years' time for a one tier. Because if I was representing private eye, I would turn and saying, why are we being excluded from bus lanes when it's only 6 months longer their knowledge is than what our people have to learn? That's not the answer. The answer is so simple, and I'm sorry to keep harping on this. Put it back into its box. Put it back into its box. Never got no problem with competition. We've had competition for many years. But stop private hire applying for hire. And that's not just one particular private hire company or app. That's all of them. Because they've all got a taste of that market. And, we're the immediate hire market. They're the pre-book market. Put it back into its box and everything will go back to its natural position.
Thank you. Susan?
I'll be really very quick because mine was pretty similar. I mean, you actually said that in 6 weeks they do the same job as you. That is absolute nonsense. Any of us that have used taxis know, you know the shortcuts, you know where you're going, and that is the knowledge. But I do agree with Joanne. We have to embrace technology to an extent, and I wonder whether there are ways that you could put various different pieces of technology into the knowledge that would reduce that, because I accept all that time training is a long time. So I'll leave it at that because it was the same sort of point.
I'm sorry that you felt that my comment was nonsense, but it's factually correct. If I can go around working off an app after 6 weeks and I'm doing exactly the same job as a taxi driver, applying for hire, showing my availability and visit, that's not nonsense, that's a fact.
No, but if you actually consider yourself in the same league as somebody that can do that at 6 weeks and that you're exactly the same,
but the TfL have allowed the lines to be blurred.
You're putting yourself down with respect, because what I'm saying to you is that black taxi drivers, in my view, are in a different league. Therefore, I think you put yourself down by saying that in 6 weeks you do exactly the same job, because manifestly you do not.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. And then all we've got to do is convince TfL.
That's generally accepted, but price is always king.
Yeah, I know.
But it can't all be about a race to the bottom, which is why we're trying to look at standards in all of this. I just want to pick up just finally a couple of environmental points. I heard you answered the stuff earlier about the new environmental standards and the challenges with the new vehicle. There's been a pilot up in Birmingham about converting existing taxis to LPG, which I know isn't the cleanest, but it is cleaner than the current taxis. Do you think TfL should be encouraging that? Is that something you're interested in? And also, if you've got any comment on the infrastructure, the rapid charging points and so on that's needed for this electric revolution. Steve, go to you first.
On the charging infrastructure, it's woefully inadequate.
Yeah.
Although this is probably the one area where TfL shine above the boroughs. TfL own 5% of London's major roads, as you're aware, and yet the vast majority of rapid charging is on TfL roads. I mean, most of the boroughs have put no rapid charging points in at all. Mm-hmm. And it's a bit of a horse and cart situation. You're telling guys to buy electric cabs to use them at their they're most efficient. You have to be able to charge them. The charging infrastructure is woefully low. There's no charging points in Westminster. There's no rapid charging points in the City of London. You know, the wealthiest square mile anywhere in the world haven't got a single rapid charge point. I mean, basically, it's a disgrace. So we've got a problem with infrastructure charging these vehicles. The funding is currently we get $4,500 off of OLEV. Everybody gets that. If you go out and buy a Nissan Leaf, you would get that off of it. We also get an extra $3,000 off from the mayor, so that knocks it up to $7,500, brings the price of the cab down from 66.5 down to 57, 58. But what the mayor's also got, he's got a £40 million pot, which initially was set up as a decommissioning scheme, whereby you were going to get an allowance for trading in an older cab or decommissioning an older vehicle, and you were going to get extra funding on that. At the time, it was a good idea. Unfortunately, as time's moved on, it's no longer a good idea because the cab has no value outside of London anymore, because many of the local authorities now insist on a minimum Euro 6 for a first licensing. So these older cabs are not worth anything. So what we're saying to TfL is what they need to do now is look at alternative ways of using this 40 million quid to incentivise guys to buy more of these electric vehicles, to enable us to fund us, to enable the funding. Various places around the country, Coventry as one. The big issue is that it can't be state aid. You're not allowed to get state aid. In Coventry, the way they've got round it is they give the driver an insurance contribution and a running contribution. So you buy an electric cab, you get £2,000 towards your charging, you get $1,500 or £2,000 towards your rapid charging for a year as an additional incentive. That's something that TfL need to be looking at. Perhaps the decommissioning scheme could be evolved. The mayor's got this 40 million quid, it's ring-fenced. Our argument is let's use it, let's get these vehicles on the street now, rather than keeping it in a pot on a scheme that obviously isn't working. So far only 103 people have applied for the decommissioning scheme. It's not working. Let's look at it, let's change it, let's get some money out there.
What about the LPG issue? Because
LPG
it's
conversions.
clean. I know it's not perfectly clean, but it's cleaner than what's there now.
The issue with LPG is the biggest problem environmentally is the Euro 5 vehicles. Funny enough, they're worse than the older Euro 4 vehicles because of the NOx. The Euro 5 vehicles have a DPF, a diesel particulate filter, collects the particulates, burns it off, creates NOx. Big problem, Euro 5. There's currently an LPG solution out for the TX4, the traditional black cab, but there's no LPG solution for the Vito. And there's almost as many Euro 5 Vitos, the Mercedes, on the street as there is as the TX4. A current LPG conversion is around £10,000. Would it be economically viable to use the fund at $10,000 a pop to trade a vehicle for LPG, or would it be more economic to put it towards an electric vehicle? You've
not got a particular view on that yet.
Because there's no alternative for the Mercedes anyway, and the other problem we've got is because of the take-up in ZEC vehicles, there's massive fall in RVs at the moment. Residual values are falling rapidly, particularly on older vehicles. If you then start doing LPG conversions, is it going to interfere with the market more? I'd have to look at that in a great deal more detail than it's been looked at.
Okay. Anyone else got any views on LPG?
I think we perhaps, in hindsight, should have looked at LPG a few years back, and it needs to be noted. And I'll finish on this if you want to know what TfL was all about. Remember, 4 years ago they decided, quite rightly, to clean up the London taxi trade, and you would have an electric vehicle from 2018. Never done a thing about it. They also said, but by 2020 you'll have 9,000 on the road. So where did they get this 9,000 figure? Why is it 17,000? Why is it not 7,000? Where did they get that plug? Before anyone's even gone and designed this taxi, before they've even designed this taxi, there's a caveat in for 9,000 by 2020. But last year, I was going to many meetings with TfL, and I kept asking, well, where's the infrastructure? The taxi's being launched in January. Where's the infrastructure? And it was just, oh, don't worry, we've got it in hand, we're going to give you a list. And the sarcastic comment that was said to me, I promise you'll have a list by Christmas Eve, so Christmas Day you can go and visit all the charging points. Now that is the same, and I've also been, as I said earlier on, the victim of the case, if you don't like it, take us to court. So I waited on Christmas Day because I thought I'd give my family a break from me, and I will go out and visit. I will go out and visit these charging points. Never, but they don't exist, do they? And that's the reality. But yeah, and my family are devastated. I spent Christmas Day, but these points don't exist. And it's a sad indictment. We've had 4 years to prepare for this because you took a decision in 2014 that 2018 the electric vehicle.
Yeah.
It's no good looking at 2017 and in 2018 to put the charging point in.
Absolutely right.
Absolutely right. Okay, Alan, quickly.
Yes, I think it would have been a very good thing, but as the older vehicles are coming off now, I think the horse has already voted, because as we see in Hackney and other areas, they're electric vehicles only. They've already started it in Camden, so there's no allowance for them there. So they would be part of the...
Okay, lovely, thank you.
Can I just add that the TfL went in partnership with private enterprises to supply these charging points. And one of the partners, Polar, have subsequently refused to allow taxi drivers onto the scheme. They started off allowing them on, and now they have to pay the cash price, which is about 5 times as much as doing it under the card scheme.
Right, so there's some issues there we need to pick up. Okay, lovely. Thank you, Alan, Steve, Trevor and Mick for your evidence this afternoon. If there are points you wanted to make that we haven't had time to, please do submit them in writing because we're still collecting evidence. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Thank you, members, as well. The date of our next meeting is Tuesday the 13th of November at 10 o'clock in Committee Room 5. I think that's because of the planning inquiry in the Chamber. And I've got no other urgent business. That ends our meeting. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
GLA Chamber